My name is Clara. I am 31 years old, a certified public accountant, working grueling hours for a local logistics firm, and a single mother to an amazing 6-year-old autistic boy named Leo. When I collapsed on my kitchen floor from a stroke, completely paralyzed on my left side, I used my last ounce of strength to call my sister and beg her to watch my son. Instead of calling for help, she whispered, "He is your burden, not mine." And then she hung up on me. She had no idea our father was standing right behind her, listening to every word. And she certainly had no idea that a few months later, at a formal family dinner, Dad would open his $3.2 million trust, completely destroy her perfect country club life, and trap her with a secret condition that made her hands shake in front of everyone. Before I tell you how a single phone call exposed a decade of greed and flipped my sister's wealthy world upside down, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. Also drop a comment below and let me know which state you are watching from and what time it is there. I love reading your comments and connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to the terrifying Friday evening when my whole life almost ended. It was 5:45 on a Friday evening. If you know anything about raising a child on the autism spectrum, you know that 5:45 is not just a time on the clock. It is a sacred deadline. Leo needed his dinner at exactly 6 o'clock, not 5:59, not 6:01, 6 o'clock sharp, and not just any dinner. It had to be his dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets, baked exactly 14 minutes, so they were crispy, but not hard-paired with exactly half a cup of steamed carrots placed in his blue divided plate where none of the food items were touching. As a single mother, my entire existence was a carefully choreographed dance to keep Leo's world predictable and safe. I had just gotten home from a punishing 10-hour shift at the logistics firm, where I worked as a CPA. It was the end of the month, which meant endless reconciliations, chasing down missing invoices, and staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned. But there was no time to be tired. I dropped my briefcase by the door, kicked off my heels, and immediately went to work in the kitchen. Leo was sitting at the kitchen island, happily lining up his toy trains in a perfect unbroken row. He was humming a soft, rhythmic tune, completely lost in his own beautiful world. Looking at him, my heart swelled with that fierce protective love only a mother knows. I opened the freezer, grabbed a bag of nuggets, and turned toward the oven. That was when the nightmare began. It did not feel like a sudden heart attack or a dramatic gasp for air. It started as a strange cold tingling at the base of my neck. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a pinched nerve from hunching over my desk all day. I reached for the baking sheet, but my fingers would not close around the metal rim. I stared at my left hand. It was trembling, refusing to obey the commands my brain was desperately sending. Suddenly, the kitchen lights seemed to flicker, expanding into bright, blinding halos. A loud, high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the sound of Leo's humming. I tried to take a step back to brace myself against the granite counter, but my left leg simply gave out. It felt like someone had severed the strings, controlling the entire left side of my body. I crashed onto the hardwood floor. The baking sheet clattered loudly against the tile, sending a deafening metallic crash echoing through the house. I hit the ground hard, my shoulder and cheek taking the brunt of the impact. The air was knocked out of my lungs. I tried to push myself up, but half of my body was dead weight. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. I was 31. I was healthy. I worked hard, paid my taxes, and did everything right. This could not be happening. But the numbness was spreading, creeping up my jaw, pulling the left side of my face downward in a sluggish, heavy droop. A transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke. Though at that moment, lying helpless on the floor, I did not know the medical term. I only knew I was trapped inside a failing body. The loud crash of the baking pan shattered Leo's peaceful world. The sudden noise combined with the horrifying sight of me falling was simply too much for his sensory system to process. He dropped his toy trains and clamped his hands over his ears. He let out a sharp, high-pitched cry, a sound of pure, unfiltered terror that tore straight through my heart. He scrambled backwards, sliding off his stool, and retreated into the far corner of the kitchen, pressing his back against the cabinets. He started rocking back and forth, crying out, completely overwhelmed. I wanted to tell him Mommy was okay. I wanted to tell him everything was fine. But when I opened my mouth, the words came out as a thick, slurred jumble of nonsense. My tongue felt like a block of lead. I could not form consonants. I could not soothe my baby. Seeing his mother paralyzed and making strange guttural noises only amplified Leo's panic. He squeezed his eyes shut and rocked faster, his cries growing louder and more frantic. The emotional agony of watching my child in distress, knowing I could not reach him, was 1,000 times worse than the physical paralysis. I was his entire world. I was his safety net. If I died right here on my own kitchen floor, what would happen to him? Who would know to cut the itchy tags off his shirts? Who would know that he needs his heavy weighted blanket to sleep? Who would understand that when he flaps his hands, it means he's overwhelmed and needs a quiet space? The terrifying thought of leaving him alone in this house, scared and uncomprehending, sent a surge of pure adrenaline through my system. I had to get help. I had to make sure he was safe. My cell phone was in the pocket of my blazer, which I had tossed onto the entryway bench, maybe 10 feet away. 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles. Using my functioning right arm and right leg, I dragged myself across the kitchen floor. It was agonizing, undignified work. I dug my right heel into the hardwood, pushed, and slid forward an inch at a time. My left arm dragged behind me like a useless appendage. I could hear myself breathing in ragged, uneven gasps. The floor was freezing against my cheek. Every scrape against the wood sent a jolt of pain through my shoulder, but I did not stop. Leo's crying echoed in my ears, driving me forward. Finally, my fingers brushed against the fabric of my blazer. I fumbled frantically, my right hand digging into the pocket until I felt the smooth glass of my phone. I pulled it out, my thumb shaking violently as I tried to unlock the screen. The facial recognition failed because my face was drooping. I had to type in my passcode. My vision was blurring at the edges, dark spots dancing in my peripheral sight. I tapped the numbers, missing twice before finally getting it right. I needed someone to come immediately. I needed someone to stay with Leo while the paramedics took me away. The only person close enough, the only family member who lived just 10 minutes away in her massive gated community house, was my older sister, Stephanie. Stephanie was 33, married to a junior corporate executive named Bradley, and lived a life of country club lunches, designer clothes, and carefully curated social media posts. We were not close. She had always viewed my life as a cautionary tale. To Stephanie, my grueling job as an accountant and my daily struggles as a single mother to an autistic child were just proof that I was inferior. She never missed an opportunity to remind me how perfectly her own life had turned out. I knew she would be annoyed that I was calling. I knew she would complain. But she was my sister, and this was a life or death emergency. Surely in a moment of pure crisis, blood would matter. I tapped her name and hit the speakerphone icon, dropping the phone onto the floor next to my ear because I no longer had the strength to hold it. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. With every ring, my consciousness seemed to slip a little further away. The edges of the room were turning gray. Come on, Stephanie. Please pick up. Please. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Clara. I really cannot talk right now. Stephanie's voice drifted through the speaker, crisp and impatient. In the background, I could hear the clinking of glass and the soft murmur of classical music. Bradley and I are getting ready for the country club wine tasting gala. I still have to finish my hair, and you know how Bradley gets if we are late. I tried to speak. I pushed all the air out of my lungs, trying to force my paralyzed mouth to form the words, "Help." I managed to croak out. It sounded awful guttural and thick. Stroke. Leo. Please. There was a pause on the line. I prayed she understood. I prayed the terror in my garbled voice was enough to cut through her self-absorption. Clara, have you been drinking? Stephanie sighed, a sharp sound of profound irritation. Honestly, this is so typical of you. I told you I am busy. I am not dealing with one of your dramatic meltdowns right now. Just put Leo in front of the television and go sleep it off. No. I sobbed, the sound tearing from my throat. My right hand clawed at the floor. Please, cannot move. Dying. I heard her shift the phone. I heard the unmistakable sound of annoyance. She did not hear my fear. She only heard an inconvenience. She thought I was exaggerating a panic attack, or worse, that I was just trying to ruin her perfect evening. I looked over at Leo, who was still rocking in the corner, his small hands pressing against his ears, tears streaming down his face. I needed her to come. I needed her to just drive 10 minutes down the road and sit with my son so he would not be alone when the ambulance arrived. I was begging her with everything I had left. Then Stephanie lowered her voice into a harsh, venomous whisper. She wanted to make absolutely sure Bradley could not hear her cruelty from the other room. "Stop being so dramatic, Clara," she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "He is your burden, not mine. Figure it out yourself." And then she hung up. The line went dead. A flat mechanical beep echoed from the speaker, sealing my fate. I lay there on the cold hardwood floor, staring at the screen as it faded to black. She had left me to die. She had left my 6-year-old autistic son alone with his paralyzed mother so she could go drink wine. The sheer magnitude of her betrayal hit me harder than the stroke itself. My own sister, my own blood had weighed my life and my son's safety against a country club party, and we had lost. The phone speaker amplified my sister's voice, bouncing her impatient tone off the kitchen tiles. I lay there, paralyzed, my face pressed against the cold floor, listening to the person I shared blood with complain about her schedule, while my brain was quite literally misfiring. Stephanie did not sound worried. She sounded deeply, profoundly inconvenienced. I could hear the ambient noise of a high-end salon in the background. Snippets of polite laughter, the hum of hairdryers, the clinking of a ceramic coffee cup against a saucer. "Clara, I am literally in the chair getting a blowout." Stephanie sighed, the sharp exhale crackling through the phone. "Bradley and I are hosting the silent auction at the country club wine gala tonight. Do you have any idea how important this is for his promotion? The partners are all going to be there. I cannot show up looking like I just rolled out of bed because you failed to plan your evening properly." I tried again to force my mouth to work. I needed her to understand that this was not a scheduling conflict. This was not a request for a casual babysitter. I was trapped inside my own body watching my 6-year-old autistic son spiral into a complete sensory meltdown in the corner of the kitchen. Leo was rocking violently now, his hands clamped over his ears to block out the sound of my ragged breathing and the harsh metallic echo of Stephanie's voice. I needed to say the word stroke. I needed to say ambulance, but my tongue was dead weight. The only sound that escaped my lips was a wet, heavy groan. "Are you even listening to me?" Stephanie snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Honestly, Clara, you always do this. You wait until the last possible second to deal with your life, and then you expect me to drop everything to bail you out. I have my own life. Bradley has a career. We have obligations that do not revolve around your constant crisis. Just put on a cartoon for him. Give him his iPad. You know how he gets when you coddle him. Just go lie down and stop acting like the world is ending." My right hand, the only limb I could still fully control, curled into a tight fist against the hardwood floor. A tear slipped from my right eye, cutting a hot path down my cheek. I was dying. I genuinely believed I was dying right there, next to the spilled bag of dinosaur chicken nuggets, and my sister was lecturing me about a wine gala. I looked at the phone screen. The call duration was ticking upward. 45 seconds. 50 seconds. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left in my lungs. I focused entirely on my jaw, my throat, my lips. "Leo," I gasped out. The word was terribly slurred, sounding more like a desperate guttural plea than a human name. "Alone. Help him." There was a brief pause on the line. For a fraction of a second, I thought the sheer terror in my broken voice had finally pierced through her bubble of self-obsession. I thought the sister I had grown up with, the girl who used to share secrets with me in the dark when we were children, would finally wake up and realize something was horribly wrong. I waited for her tone to shift. I waited for her to drop the salon cape, run to her car, and tell me she was on her way. Instead, I heard her whisper to someone else, probably her stylist, asking them to hold on for a moment. The background noise muffled slightly as she covered the receiver with her hand. When she spoke to me again, her voice was low, harsh, and dripping with an absolute icy venom. "Stop being so dramatic, Clara." The words struck me like a physical blow. "You chose to keep him," she hissed, making sure her voice was quiet enough that the other women in the salon could not hear her cruelty. "You knew how hard it was going to be, and you expect everyone else to bend over backward to accommodate you. I am not ruining the most important night of Bradley's career because you cannot handle your own child. He is your burden, not mine. Figure it out yourself." A sharp mechanical click echoed from the speaker. The call dropped. The screen of my phone lit up brightly for a few seconds, displaying her smiling contact photo before fading to black. She hung up. She actually hung up. She left a paralyzed woman and a terrified autistic child alone so she could attend a wine tasting. The finality of that click settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. My own sister had just looked at my life weighted against a country club party and decided I was not worth the disruption. The word burden repeated in my mind, syncing perfectly with the frantic, terrified rocking of my little boy in the corner. I closed my eyes. The numbness was spreading further down my back now. I could not move. I could not speak. I could not save my son. I was going to fade away right here on the floor, and Leo was going to be left alone in this kitchen for hours until someone finally realized we were missing. The psychological devastation of that moment was absolute. It was a darkness deeper than the stroke itself. And then a sound cut through the silence. It was the heavy metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock. My eyes flew open. My heart gave a massive, painful jolt against my ribs. The heavy oak door swung open with a solid thud. Heavy, familiar footsteps stepped onto the entryway tile. They were the measured, deliberate steps of a man who had spent 40 years walking across commercial construction sites. Clara, a deep, booming voice called out. It was my father, Thomas. I picked up that vintage wooden train set I told you about, the one with the magnetic tracks. I thought Leo might like it before his bedtime. I could not answer him. I could only lie there, my right eye fixed on the doorway leading into the kitchen. My father walked into the room. He was 68 years old, built like a brick wall with thick silver hair and hands calloused from decades of hard labor. He was wearing his usual flannel shirt and work jeans, carrying a large cardboard box filled with wooden train pieces. He stopped dead in his tracks. The box slipped from his hands. It hit the floor with a loud crash, wooden tracks and brightly painted train cars scattering across the hardwood. He did not scream. He did not ask silly redundant questions like what happened or are you okay? My father was a man who solved problems for a living. He built skyscrapers and managed crews of hundreds. He knew how to assess a disaster scene in a fraction of a second. He saw me paralyzed on the floor, my face drooping on the left side. He saw the spilled dinner. He saw Leo having a severe meltdown in the corner. And because the acoustics in my small house carried every sound perfectly, I knew he had heard the end of the phone call. The front door had opened exactly when Stephanie had delivered her final venomous line. He had heard his eldest daughter call his autistic grandson a burden. He had heard her tell his youngest daughter to figure it out herself. My father's face, usually warm and quick to smile, when he saw Leo hardened into something I had never seen before. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a terrifying, stony mask. His jaw locked so tightly I could see a muscle twitching near his ear. There was no panic in his movements, only absolute cold precision. He stepped over the scattered train pieces and immediately went to Leo. He did not rush or grab him, knowing that sudden movements would only make an autistic meltdown worse. He knelt down slowly, keeping his distance, and spoke in a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Hey there, buddy," my father said softly, keeping his hands visible. "Grandpa is here. You are safe. I know it is loud. I know it is scary, but Grandpa has got you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones that he always kept in his truck for Leo, and gently slid them over my son's ears. The effect was almost immediate. Leo's frantic rocking slowed. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a long, shaky breath, and leaned his small body against my father's chest. My father wrapped one massive arm around him, shielding him from the chaos of the room. With his other hand, my father pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. He did not take his eyes off me. He maintained a steady, reassuring gaze, anchoring me to the room, even as my consciousness began to slip and slide away. "Yes, I need an ambulance immediately," my father said into the phone, his voice flat and authoritative. "My daughter has collapsed. She's showing severe signs of a stroke, left side paralysis, facial drooping, slurred speech. We need paramedics right now." He rattled off my address without missing a beat, answered the dispatcher's rapid-fire questions, and tossed the phone onto the counter, leaving the line open as instructed. Then he crawled across the floor until his face was inches from mine. He reached out with his large, calloused hand and gently brushed the hair out of my eyes. His touch was so tender, such a stark contrast to the massive, imposing figure he cut in the room. "Clara, look at me," he commanded softly. "Do not close your eyes yet. Look at me." I focused on his face. The kitchen was growing darker around the edges, the bright ceiling lights fading into a dull fuzzy grey. The numbness had swallowed my entire left side and was now wrapping around my chest, making every breath feel like I was inhaling through a tiny straw. "Help is coming, baby girl." My father whispered, his thumb lightly stroking my cheek. "You hold on. You just hold on for Leo. I have got him." I got him. He is perfectly safe." A tear rolled from his eye, dropping onto the floor beside me. But when I looked deeper into his expression, past the immediate fear for my life, I saw something else. I saw the echo of what he had just heard through that speakerphone. I saw the horrific realization of what his eldest daughter truly was. Stephanie had always been the golden child, the one who married well, the one who lived the picture-perfect life. But in one single unvarnished moment, my father had witnessed her profound cruelty. He had heard her abandon her own sister to die. He had heard her reject his grandson as trash. The distant wail of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood. The sound grew louder, cutting through the walls of the house, signaling that help was finally here. My father did not leave my side. He stayed right there on the floor, holding Leo tight against his chest with one arm, while his other hand kept a firm grounding grip on my shoulder. I could hear the heavy boots of paramedics rushing up the front steps. I could hear the front door being thrown wide open, voices shouting instructions, the clatter of medical equipment being wheeled into my hallway. The room suddenly filled with strangers in uniforms, their hands moving quickly, checking my vitals, asking my father questions, preparing a stretcher. But as my vision finally gave out and the world collapsed into total darkness, the last thing I saw was my father's face. He was not looking at the paramedics. He was staring at my dropped cell phone on the floor. His eyes were hard, calculating, and filled with a simmering, terrifying wrath. It was the look of a man who had just realized his family was broken and who had instantly decided exactly how he was going to fix it. I lost consciousness, knowing two things for certain. I was going to be okay because my father was there, and Stephanie had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of her entire life. She thought she was untouchable in her country club mansion. She thought she could discard us like garbage and walk away without a scratch. But a storm was coming for her, a storm engineered by the man who built empires for a living. And as the darkness pulled me under, I knew with absolute certainty that she would not survive it. The first thing I became aware of was the rhythmic, piercing beep of a heart monitor. It was a cold mechanical sound that anchored me to a reality I desperately did not want to face. I slowly fluttered my eyes open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room blinded me for a moment, forcing me to blink away the stark white glare. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and bleached linens. I tried to shift my weight and a terrifying jolt of panic shot through my chest. The left side of my body felt like it was encased in wet cement. It was heavy, sluggish, and aching with a dull, throbbing weakness. I turned my head. My father was sitting in a cheap vinyl chair beside my bed. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. He saw my eyes open and immediately leaned forward, resting his large, rough hand over my right hand. He told me Leo was safe. He told me my little boy was fast asleep in his own bed, being watched by my trusted neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who knew all of Leo's routines. The relief that washed over me was so profound, it brought fresh tears to my eyes. My baby was safe, but the relief was short-lived. A doctor wearing a crisp white coat stepped into the room holding a digital tablet. He introduced himself and delivered the diagnosis with a clinical, detached precision that made my stomach churn. He confirmed I had suffered a severe transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke. He told me I was incredibly lucky my father had found me and called paramedics when he did. He looked at my chart, then looked at me, his expression softening slightly. He explained that a stroke at 31 years old was highly unusual. He said my blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels brought on by what he called extreme chronic stress and severe exhaustion. My body had essentially hit the absolute limit of what it could endure, and it had pulled the emergency brake. He told me I needed rest. He told me I needed to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation, cardiovascular scans, and neurological testing. He used words like preventative care and comprehensive screening. Every word he spoke felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. While the doctor talked about recovery, my brain trained by years of balancing ledgers and managing tight budgets, instantly began calculating the financial ruin heading my way. I was a single mother. I worked as a CPA for a logistics company that offered only the most basic high-deductible health insurance plan. I did not have a premium platinum package. I had a plan designed for catastrophes with an out-of-pocket maximum that I knew would completely drain the meager savings I had scraped together. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, the crushing anxiety of medical debt paralyzed me just as effectively as the stroke had. I thought about the thousands of dollars I would owe for the ambulance ride alone. I thought about the emergency room fees, the neurologist consultations, the MRI scans, the nights in a hospital bed that cost more than a luxury hotel suite. I had been saving every spare dollar for Leo's specialized occupational therapy, denying myself new clothes, proper meals, and any semblance of a social life just to give him a fighting chance. Now a single medical emergency was going to wipe out everything. I closed my eyes, feeling hot tears leak into my hairline. I was drowning, and I had not even seen the bill yet. The quiet dread of the room was suddenly shattered. The heavy wooden door to my room swung open with enough force to bang against the wall stopper. In walked my sister Stephanie, followed closely by her husband Bradley. They moved into the sterile quiet space like actors stepping onto a brightly lit stage. Stephanie was clutching a massive, absurdly lavish arrangement of white lilies and pink orchids. The bouquet was so large, she practically had to peer around it. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat, pristine white trousers, and a silk blouse. Her hair was perfectly styled, the blowout from the salon looking absolutely flawless. She looked like she was arriving at an upscale charity luncheon, not an intensive care unit. Bradley was right behind her, dressed in his custom-tailored corporate suit, checking his expensive watch like he had a boardroom meeting to get to. "Oh my gosh, my poor sweet sister," Stephanie cried out. Her voice was pitched loudly, intentionally projecting toward the open door where a passing nurse had paused to look. Stephanie rushed to the side of my bed, her face contorted into a mask of theatrical devastation. We rushed here as fast as we could. I was so terrified. I could not even breathe when I heard the news. She placed the giant bouquet on the small tray table, knocking over my plastic cup of water in the process. She did not even notice the spill. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight, and turned her head slightly to ensure the nursing staff could see the picture of a devoted, heartbroken sibling. I stared at her, feeling a wave of absolute revulsion. Just hours ago, she had been annoyed that I was having a medical emergency. She had called my autistic son a burden. She had left me to die on my kitchen floor because she did not want to ruin her hair for a country club wine gala. And here she was, her hair absolutely perfect, putting on a show for strangers. Bradley stood at the foot of the bed, offering me a tight, uncomfortable smile. He looked completely out of place. "Glad you are pulling through, Clara," he said, using his booming executive voice. "Gave us a real scare." Steph was beside herself. We dropped everything to be here. I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and slap the smug, self-satisfied expressions right off their faces. I wanted to tell the nurses the truth, but my speech was still sluggish, and the left side of my face felt heavy and unresponsive. I could only glare at her. Stephanie leaned down, bringing her face close to mine. Her expensive, heavy perfume masked the smell of the hospital antiseptic, making me feel nauseous. She positioned her body so my father, who was still sitting silently in the corner of the room, could not see her face clearly. She brought her mouth right next to my ear. "Listen to me," she whispered, her tone suddenly shifting from theatrical grief to a rapid defensive hiss. The connection on the phone was terrible. "You were mumbling. You know you are always having anxiety attacks over your usual money problems. I thought you were just having another panic attack about paying your rent or something. You cannot blame me for not understanding you. You are fine now anyway. Do not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Do you understand?" The sheer audacity of her words took my breath away. She was gaslighting me while I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke. She was trying to rewrite history, blaming her cruelty on a bad connection and my financial struggles. She was calling my near-death experience a panic attack to absolve herself of the horrific reality that she had abandoned me. I felt my heart monitor pick up its pace, the beeping growing faster and louder as pure rage flooded my system. I tried to pull my hand out of her grip, but she held on tight, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "That is enough." The voice was low, deep, and carried a dangerous, rumbling weight that made the hairs on my arms stand up. My father stood up from the vinyl chair in the corner of the room. He had been sitting in the shadows completely silent since Stephanie and Bradley entered the room. He had watched the entire performance. He had watched her arrange the flowers. He had watched her lean in to whisper in my ear. Stephanie jumped back from the bed, startled by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. She spun around, pasting a wide, innocent smile on her face. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I did not see you over there in the dark. Is it not awful? Poor Clara. We are just so relieved she's okay. Bradley and I are going to pay for the best room service they have here. We want to make sure she's comfortable." My father did not smile back. He stepped into the light. He looked at the giant bouquet of lilies. He looked at Bradley's tailored suit. Then he locked his eyes onto Stephanie. "Cut the egg, Stephanie," he said. The words were flat and devoid of any parental warmth. Stephanie blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Act." "What act, Dad? I'm just worried about my sister." "I said cut the act," my father repeated, taking a slow step forward. The sheer physical presence of the man, a retired construction contractor who was used to commanding unruly crews of tough men, filled the hospital room. I was in the kitchen, Stephanie. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Stephanie froze. Bradley shifted uncomfortably at the foot of the bed, suddenly looking very interested in the linoleum floor tiles. "What do you mean?" Stephanie stammered, her voice losing its confident edge. "I mean, I walked into the house exactly when Clara had you on speakerphone," my father said. His voice was not a yell. It was a deadly, quiet growl. "I heard you tell your sister that she was being dramatic. I heard you tell her that your nephew was her burden, not yours. I heard you tell her to figure it out herself while she was lying paralyzed on the floor. I heard the click when you hung up on her." Stephanie's face drained of color. The perfect, polished country club socialite vanished, replaced by a panicked woman caught in a lie she could not charm her way out of. She took a step back, her hands fluttering defensively. "Dad, you do not understand. I was in the salon. It was loud. I thought she was just stressed about money again. She is always stressed. I did not know she was actually sick." "Get out," my father said. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the heavy wooden door. "Dad, please. You have to let me explain. I do not want your explanations, and I do not want your fake flowers." My father said, his voice dropping another octave. "You left your sister to die because you did not want to be late for a wine tasting. You called my grandson a burden. You disgust me. Get out of this room before I have security throw you out." Bradley stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to salvage the situation with his corporate negotiating tactics. "Now hold on a second, Thomas. Let us not be hasty. Emotions are running high. Stephanie made a mistake, but we are family. We should all just calm down and—" My father cut his eyes to Bradley. "You will leave right now, Bradley, or I promise you I will make a scene right here in this hallway that will ruin whatever reputation you think you have. Do not test me today." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He grabbed Stephanie's arm. "Come on, Steph. Let us go. We will talk to him when he is thinking clearly." Stephanie looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and fear. She wanted to say something else, but the terrifying glare of my father silenced her. Bradley practically dragged her out of the room. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind them, clicking into place with a solid, satisfying sound. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. The chaotic energy of Stephanie's performance had vanished, leaving only the steady beep of my heart monitor. I let out a long, ragged breath, feeling a tension I did not know I was holding finally release from my shoulders. My father did not immediately return to his chair. He walked over to the tray table, picked up the massive bouquet of lilies and orchids, and calmly dropped it straight into the grey trash can by the sink. Then he walked over to the side of my bed and sat back down. He looked at me for a long time. His expression had shifted. The protective, angry father who had just kicked his eldest daughter out of the room was gone. In his place was a man who looked deeply troubled, calculating, and intensely focused. The dynamic in the room changed completely. The crisis of the stroke was over. A new, far more complicated conflict was about to begin. "Clara," he said quietly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I swallowed my throat dry. "Okay." I managed to say my speech still a little slow. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, turning it over in his rough hands before looking back up at me. "You're a certified public accountant. You look at numbers all day long. You find discrepancies for a living. That is what you do right." "Yes," I replied, confused by the sudden change in topic. I need your laptop, he said flatly. I need the password to your computer. I blinked in surprise. My laptop was at my house, sitting in my briefcase in the entryway. My laptop? Why? My father looked toward the closed door, as if checking to ensure no one was listening. 4 years ago, when I decided to start stepping back from the construction business, I gave Bradley and Stephanie control over a portion of my commercial real estate portfolio. I gave them access to the accounts. I thought it would be good for them. I thought Bradley could use his business degree to learn how to manage real estate to keep the family wealth growing. He paused, his jaw tightening. Lately, things have not been adding up. He continued, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. Bradley has been handing me quarterly reports that look fine on paper, but the cash flow from the commercial rentals is missing. He claims it is market fluctuation. He claims it is rising maintenance costs and property taxes. I am an old builder, Clara. I know concrete and steel. I do not know complex financial routing. I do not know how to read between the lines of a corporate audit. But you do. I stared at him, the fog of the hospital medications suddenly lifting from my brain. You think Bradley is stealing from you? I think my eldest daughter just proved she's capable of leaving her own sister for dead over a country club party. My father said, his eyes turning cold and dark. I think people who are completely devoid of empathy are usually devoid of honesty too. I need you to access the cloud drive, where they upload the property ledgers. I need you to use your skills to look at the money. I need to know exactly what they have been doing behind my back. The gravity of what he was asking settled over me. I was lying in a hospital bed, half my face paralyzed, terrified of the crushing medical debt hanging over my head. And now my father was asking me to launch a forensic audit against my own sister and brother-in-law. He was asking me to pull the thread that could unravel our entire family. I looked into his eyes. I saw the same man who had knelt on my kitchen floor and put noise-canceling headphones on my autistic son. I saw the man who had stayed by my side while my sister walked away. My laptop is in my black briefcase by the front door, I told him, my voice steadying. Bring it to me. I will find every single cent. My father left the sterile confines of my hospital room and returned exactly 45 minutes later. He held my battered black leather briefcase in one hand and a generic cup of vending machine coffee in the other. He stepped inside and pulled the heavy wooden door shut, pressing until it engaged with a definitive, solid click that sealed us away from the prying eyes and bustling noise of the intensive care unit. I was propped up against a stack of 3 thin, uncomfortable hospital pillows, the intravenous line taping my right arm to a stiff plastic board. My left side still felt entirely alien to me, heavy and numb like it belonged to a mannequin, but my right hand was perfectly functional. And my mind, fueled by a mixture of residual adrenaline and a slowly building icy fury, had never been sharper. He placed the laptop directly onto the rolling tray table and carefully swung it over my lap. As the machine booted up, bathing the dim hospital room in a harsh blue light, my father pulled his cheap vinyl chair closer to the bed. He leaned in and kept his voice low, pitching his tone so that it would not carry through the drywall and into the hallway. 4 years ago, he explained, his voice thick with a regret. He was only just beginning to process. He had decided it was finally time to start stepping back from his business. He had spent his entire adult life building a robust portfolio of commercial real estate from absolute scratch. He owned strip malls in the bustling suburbs, a few highly profitable mid-sized warehouse spaces, and 2 medical office buildings. He had worked grueling hours swinging hammers and pouring concrete in his youth to build a legacy so he could eventually enjoy his retirement. He wanted to spend his golden years fishing on the lake. He wanted to spend more time playing with Leo. Stephanie had seen an opening. She had convinced him that Bradley, with his fancy corporate title, his expensive business degree, and his pristine tailored suits, was the perfect person to take over the day-to-day management of 3 of his most profitable properties. Bradley was supposed to learn the family business from the ground up. Stephanie had practically beamed when they pitched the idea at our Thanksgiving dinner, talking endlessly about legacy and preserving generational wealth. My father had trusted them completely. He had handed over the administrative access to the property management accounts, the maintenance funds, and the vendor ledgers without a second thought. At first, everything looked absolutely perfect. The quarterly reports Bradley submitted to my father were beautifully formatted, filled with colorful bar charts, pie graphs, and sophisticated corporate jargon about market stabilization, tenant retention, and proactive asset management. But my father was a builder at heart. He possessed an instinct for when a property should be generating strong cash flow, and he knew that for the past 18 months, his actual bank accounts were remaining suspiciously stagnant, while Bradley's polished reports claimed everything was flourishing. I typed in my laptop password using only my right hand. My fingers felt slightly clumsy, but I managed to open my secure accounting software and log into the encrypted cloud drive my father directed me toward. As a certified public accountant, numbers are my primary language. Numbers do not lie. They do not manipulate you. They do not pretend a cellular connection was bad when you were begging for your life. They simply lay out the truth in plain sight. I navigated through the folders and pulled up the master ledgers for the 3 commercial properties Bradley was supposed to be managing. I started with the basic fundamentals of a financial audit. I ran a comparative analysis between the incoming rental revenue and the outgoing operating expenses. It took my trained eyes less than 20 minutes to spot the first glaring anomaly. My gaze locked onto a recurring expense line for a vendor registered as Summit Apex Contracting. According to the ledger, this company was billing my father's property accounts for roughly $12,000 every single month. The invoices were perfectly coded and categorized to avoid triggering automatic flags. They were listed as routine HV, AC maintenance, commercial roof resealing, and parking lot repaving. I looked up at my father. The harsh fluorescent light cast deep, tired shadows over the heavy lines on his face. "Dad," I asked quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level, "did you ever hire a company called Summit Apex Contracting to handle the commercial HVAC units for your medical buildings?" He frowned, leaning closer to peer at the glowing screen. "No," he said firmly. "I have used the exact same local union crew for 20 years. I do not know any Summit Apex." I pulled up the state business registry on my secondary browser tab. I typed in the limited liability company name. The registered agent was listed as a generic corporate privacy service, which was standard practice for shell companies actively trying to hide their true owners. But they had made a sloppy, arrogant mistake. People who think they are smarter than everyone else always make sloppy mistakes. The billing address for the LLC matched a post office box located in downtown Seattle. I dug further, pulling the tax routing numbers attached to the vendor payments and cross-referencing them with a public property records database. It took me another 30 minutes of relentless clicking, my right hand flying across the trackpad as fast as I could manage, but I eventually found the hidden thread. The registered manager for the corporate privacy service was another shell company, and that shell company was registered directly under Bradley's name. The money from my father's hard-working commercial tenants was not going toward roof repairs or new air conditioning units. It was being systematically routed through a fake contracting business directly into a private bank account controlled entirely by my sister and her husband. I felt a profound freezing chill run straight down my spine, replacing the lingering medical numbness of the stroke with a completely different kind of paralysis. I opened up the historical data, filtering the records all the way back to the exact month my father had proudly handed them the keys to his accounts. I started pulling every single invoice submitted by Summit Apex Contracting alongside 2 other highly suspicious vendors I quickly identified in the general ledger. I created a fresh spreadsheet. With every fraudulent number I inputted, the total climbed higher and higher. $50,000, $120,000, $200,000. I pulled out my cell phone with trembling fingers and opened my sister's social media pages. I began comparing the dates of the largest, most fraudulent corporate withdrawals against the dates of her most boastful, extravagant posts. The correlation was undeniable and absolutely sickening. In March of last year, they had billed my father's estate $25,000 for a completely fabricated foundation repair on a warehouse. 3 days later, Stephanie posted a glossy photograph of her brand new custom-ordered Porsche SUV, complete with a long caption about being so incredibly blessed and married to such a hard worker. In November, a fake invoice for $40,000 in commercial landscaping matched perfectly with their 2-week luxury vacation to the Amalfi Coast. They had used my father's retirement funds to clear massive personal credit card debts, pay for exclusive country club memberships, and fund a lifestyle they could never actually afford. I sat in that sterile hospital bed staring at the glowing spreadsheet, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me that had absolutely nothing to do with my cardiovascular system. The contrast between her life and mine hit me with the force of a physical blow. I thought about the last 4 years of my life. I thought about the countless nights I sat alone at my tiny kitchen table, crying silently over a towering stack of medical bills, trying desperately to figure out how I was going to afford Leo's specialized speech and occupational therapy. I thought about how I lived on buttered noodles and skipped my own meals just so I could buy the expensive sensory-friendly clothing that did not make my autistic son scream in physical pain. I thought about how I had taken on extra weekend accounting clients, ruining my own health, pushing my blood pressure so dangerously high that my brain had literally short-circuited on my kitchen floor. While I was begging the universe for just a little bit of breathing room, while I was literally working myself into a devastating stroke just to keep my disabled child safe and provided for, my sister was orchestrating a massive financial crime against our own father. She was robbing the man who had swung a hammer his entire life to build something secure for our family, and she was doing it with a perfectly practiced smile on her face. The betrayal went far deeper than a refused phone call. She was stealing the resources that could have secured her nephew's future just so she could impress strangers at a wine tasting. I hit the sum function on the master spreadsheet. The final undeniable number flashed on the screen in stark black and white. $356,420. I slowly rotated the laptop on the tray table so the screen directly faced my father. He did not say a single word. He just sat there, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy increments, staring at the final figure. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched as the horrific reality of the betrayal sank deep into his bones. This was not just a simple case of poor business management or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, predatory, systemic theft. His own daughter, the golden child he had trusted above all others, had been treating his legacy like her personal automated teller machine, all while treating her own sister like disposable garbage. My father's breathing grew ragged, his large hands resting heavily on his denim-clad knees balled into fists, so tight his knuckles turned completely white. I looked at the man who had just saved my life, the man whose life savings were being siphoned away to pay for imported wine and luxury car payments, and I felt my own heart break for him. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "We have all the proof we need. It is all right here on this screen. The routing numbers, the fake corporations, the forged invoices. It constitutes federal wire fraud and grand theft. Do you want me to call the police right now? I can have a financial detective look at this tomorrow morning. They will both be arrested and charged before the week is over." My father slowly turned his head to look at me. The expression in his eyes sent a shiver straight through my soul. There was no sadness left in him. The grieving father was gone, replaced entirely by a man composed of devastating, calculated resolve. He reached out with one steady hand and gently closed the laptop screen, ending the blue glow in the room. "No," he said, his voice dead cold. "Do not call the police. Prison is too easy. They would just hire fancy lawyers and play the victim. I have a much more painful punishment in mind." 3 days later, the hospital finally cleared me for discharge. My left side still felt incredibly weak and sluggish, a terrifying reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. The doctors assured me that with intense physical therapy and strict stress management, I would regain my full mobility. But as my father pushed me through the sliding glass doors in a standard-issue hospital wheelchair, my mind was not on my physical recovery. My brain was furiously calculating the catastrophic cost of the last 72 hours. I had basic health insurance. The ambulance ride, the emergency room fees, the neurological scans, and the 3 nights in a specialized care unit were going to result in a medical bill so massive it would completely wipe out the tiny emergency fund I had scraped together for my son. I expected my father to drive me straight back to my modest house so I could finally hold Leo. I had missed my little boy with an agonizing physical ache. But when my father pulled his heavy truck out of the hospital parking garage, he did not turn toward my neighborhood. He merged onto the highway, heading straight for the towering glass and steel skyline of downtown Seattle. I asked him where we were going. I told him I needed to see my son. My father kept his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, his jaw set like carved granite. He kept his eyes completely fixed on the road ahead and simply said we had a vital appointment to keep before I went home. The cold, unyielding determination in his voice stopped any further questions I had. We pulled into the underground parking garage of a premium high-rise commercial building. He helped me out of the truck, supporting my weak left side, and guided me into the private elevator. He pressed the button for the top floor. When the elevator doors parted, we stepped into a reception area defined by quiet, intimidating wealth. The gold lettering on the double glass doors read, Robert Davis Estate and Trust Law. This was not a storefront legal clinic for simple wills. This was the kind of elite firm that managed generational wealth, the kind of place where men in custom-tailored suits protected massive family fortunes from taxes and litigation. I was a hard-working bookkeeper who counted every single penny to afford occupational therapy for an autistic child. I felt entirely out of place in my wrinkled clothes and hospital admission bracelet. But my father walked through those glass doors with absolute authority. He led me right past the receptionist and straight into a sprawling corner office overlooking the waters of the Puget Sound. Robert Davis stood up from behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 50s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and an impeccably tailored navy suit. He had represented my father for over 20 years, handling all the complex legal structuring for my father's commercial construction company. Robert took one look at my pale face, my hospital bracelet, and my father's thunderous expression, and he immediately walked over to lock the heavy office door behind us. He knew instantly that this was not a routine social visit. My father did not waste time with pleasantries. He helped me sit in a plush leather chair, then sat down heavily beside me. He looked directly at his longtime attorney and stated that he needed a complete and immediate overhaul of his entire estate plan. I sat there, in silence, listening as my father laid out the brutal financial reality we had uncovered in my hospital room. He explained the fake contractor invoices, the hidden shell companies, and the $350,000 Stephanie and Bradley had systematically embezzled from his commercial property accounts over the past 4 years. Robert never interrupted. His professional demeanor never slipped, but his eyes narrowed with a cold, sharp understanding of the betrayal. My father told Robert that a standard last will and testament was no longer sufficient. With my background as a certified public accountant, I understood exactly why my father was making this demand. A standard will has to pass through the public probate court system after a person passes away. If my father simply wrote Stephanie out of a traditional will, she could easily hire a ruthless litigation attorney to contest the document. She could falsely claim that my father was suffering from dementia, or that I had used undue influence to manipulate him while he was vulnerable. A contested will could tie up the family assets in court for years, draining the estate with exorbitant legal fees and creating endless public drama. My father was a builder. He knew how to construct things that could withstand a storm. He wanted something absolutely bulletproof. He demanded that Robert draft a revocable living trust. For those who do not work in the financial sector, a revocable living trust is a highly powerful and impenetrable legal vehicle. Once you legally transfer your assets into the trust itself becomes the legal owner of those assets, not you as a private individual. You maintain complete control over the trust while you are alive, but the moment you pass away, the trust immediately and privately transfers total control to your named successor trustee. It completely bypasses the probate court system. It is totally private. And most importantly, it is incredibly difficult for a greedy relative to challenge in a courtroom. My father instructed Robert to draft the binding trust documents that very afternoon. He wanted no delays. Sitting in that quiet, high-end office, I watched my father aggressively transfer every single asset he had spent 40 years building into the new trust. He transferred the deeds to his highly profitable commercial strip malls. He transferred his massive residential home. He transferred his diverse stock portfolio and every single liquid cash account he possessed. The total combined value of the trust was $3.2 million. And then, without a single trace of hesitation, my father looked at his attorney and legally named me as the sole beneficiary and the sole successor trustee of the entire estate. The absolute weight of those legal terms settled over me, pressing deeply into my chest. I had spent my entire adult life feeling like an invisible afterthought in my own family. I was the sister who was expected to struggle silently. I was the daughter who was supposed to accept whatever small leftover scraps of attention my family decided to throw my way, while Stephanie lived a life of total luxury. I had always assumed Stephanie would inherit the lion's share of everything my father built. Now, in one swift, uncompromising legal maneuver, my father was handing me the keys to a $3.2 million empire. He was legally placing my future and the future safety of my autistic son behind an impenetrable fortress of wealth and security. But my father was not finished. He reached into his flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellow-lined notebook paper. He carefully smoothed it out on the polished mahogany desk and slid it across to Robert. He told the attorney that he needed a highly specific, totally non-negotiable stipulation added to the trust documents. He wanted it officially coded as Clause 7, and he explicitly stated that this specific clause was aimed directly at Stephanie. Robert picked up the piece of paper. The room grew perfectly silent as the seasoned attorney read my father's handwritten demands. I watched Robert's face closely, my heart beating a rapid rhythm against my ribs. I saw the attorney's eyebrows rise slightly. I saw him take off his wire-rimmed glasses, rub the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, heavy sigh. Robert placed the paper back on the desk, folded his hands, and looked across at my father. He spoke with the absolute gravity of a man who had seen families tear themselves apart over money for decades. Robert warned my father that the legal conditions written on that yellow paper were incredibly ruthless. He used the word punitive. He told my father that he was legally weaponizing his wealth to break his eldest daughter and that implementing such a heavy-handed psychological trap was highly unusual even in the most contentious estate planning cases. Robert gently suggested that simply cutting Stephanie out of the trust entirely would be a cleaner, faster way to handle the betrayal. My father leaned forward, planting his calloused hands firmly on the edge of the desk. The raw, unfiltered anger I had seen in his eyes when he stood in my kitchen returned in full force. He looked his attorney dead in the eye and told him exactly what had happened. He told Robert that his eldest daughter had looked at an innocent disabled child and called him a burden. He told him that Stephanie had intentionally left her own sister paralyzed on a hardwood floor just so she could go drink expensive wine at a country club event. My father's voice vibrated with a dark protective wrath as he declared that the clause would remain exactly as he had written it. He said he did not want a clean break. He wanted Stephanie to feel the exact weight of her own arrogance. He demanded that Robert seal those specific conditions into the legal framework of the trust, binding it with so much legal red tape that no judge in the state could ever untangle it. Robert held my father's gaze for a long moment, silently assessing the total permanence of the decision. Then he slowly nodded, put his wire-rimmed glasses back on his face, and turned toward his computer. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, my hands gripping the armrests, listening as Robert began translating my father's angry handwritten notes into cold, impenetrable legalese. As the words filled the quiet space of the office, the true brilliance of what my father had designed washed over me. It was not just a simple disinheritance. Completely cutting Stephanie out of the money would have given her the freedom to walk away, play the victim to her wealthy friends, and completely ignore the damage she had caused. Instead, my father had constructed a perfectly agonizing, inescapable cage. He was going to dangle a massive sum of his wealth right in front of her greedy face, but the key to unlocking that money would require her to completely surrender her ego. To get a single penny, she was going to have to humble herself and serve the very people she considered entirely beneath her. I felt a cold chill ripple across my skin as the final legal phrasing of Clause 7 was confirmed and saved into the trust document. Stephanie was currently sitting in her immaculate luxury condo, totally oblivious to the storm gathering right above her head. She was completely convinced that she had gotten away with her cruelty, completely certain that her husband's embezzlement would remain hidden, and absolutely confident that she was about to inherit millions of dollars to fund her lavish lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea how thoroughly she was about to be trapped by the very father she thought she could fool. My father left the sterile confines of my hospital room and returned exactly 45 minutes later. He held my battered black leather briefcase in one hand and a generic cup of vending machine coffee in the other. He stepped inside and pulled the heavy wooden door shut, pressing until it engaged with a definitive solid click that sealed us away from the prying eyes and bustling noise of the intensive care unit. I was propped up against a stack of 3 thin, uncomfortable hospital pillows, the intravenous line taping my right arm to a stiff plastic board. My left side still felt entirely alien to me, heavy and numb, like it belonged to a mannequin, but my right hand was perfectly functional, and my mind fueled by a mixture of residual adrenaline and a slowly building icy fury had never been sharper. He placed the laptop directly onto the rolling tray table and carefully swung it over my lap. As the machine booted up, bathing the dim hospital room in a harsh blue light, my father pulled his cheap vinyl chair closer to the bed. He leaned in and kept his voice low, pitching his tone so that it would not carry through the drywall and into the hallway. 4 years ago, he explained, his voice thick with a regret. He was only just beginning to process. He had decided it was finally time to start stepping back from his business. He had spent his entire adult life building a robust portfolio of commercial real estate from absolute scratch. He owned strip malls in the bustling suburbs, a few highly profitable mid-sized warehouse spaces, and 2 medical office buildings. He had worked grueling hours swinging hammers and pouring concrete in his youth to build a legacy so he could eventually enjoy his retirement. He wanted to spend his golden years fishing on the lake. He wanted to spend more time playing with Leo. Stephanie had seen an opening. She had convinced him that Bradley, with his fancy corporate title, his expensive business degree, and his pristine tailored suits, was the perfect person to take over the day-to-day management of 3 of his most profitable properties. Bradley was supposed to learn the family business from the ground up. Stephanie had practically beamed when they pitched the idea at our Thanksgiving dinner, talking endlessly about legacy and preserving generational wealth. My father had trusted them completely. He had handed over the administrative access to the property management accounts, the maintenance funds, and the vendor ledgers without a second thought. At first, everything looked absolutely perfect. The quarterly reports Bradley submitted to my father were beautifully formatted, filled with colorful bar charts, pie graphs, and sophisticated corporate jargon about market stabilization, tenant retention, and proactive asset management. But my father was a builder at heart. He possessed an instinct for when a property should be generating strong cash flow, and he knew that for the past 18 months, his actual bank accounts were remaining suspiciously stagnant, while Bradley's polished reports claimed everything was flourishing. I typed in my laptop password using only my right hand. My fingers felt slightly clumsy, but I managed to open my secure accounting software and log into the encrypted cloud drive my father directed me toward. As a certified public accountant, numbers are my primary language. Numbers do not lie. They do not manipulate you. They do not pretend a cellular connection was bad when you were begging for your life. They simply lay out the truth in plain sight. I navigated through the folders and pulled up the master ledgers for the 3 commercial properties Bradley was supposed to be managing. I started with the basic fundamentals of a financial audit. I ran a comparative analysis between the incoming rental revenue and the outgoing operating expenses. It took my trained eyes less than 20 minutes to spot the first glaring anomaly. My gaze locked onto a recurring expense line for a vendor registered as Summit Apex Contracting. According to the ledger, this company was billing my father's property accounts for roughly $12,000 every single month. The invoices were perfectly coded and categorized to avoid triggering automatic flags. They were listed as routine, HVAC, maintenance, commercial roof resealing, and parking lot repaving. I looked up at my father. The harsh fluorescent light cast deep, tired shadows over the heavy lines on his face. "Dad?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Did you ever hire a company called Summit Apex Contracting to handle the commercial HVAC units for your medical buildings?" He frowned, leaning closer to peer at the glowing screen. "No," he said firmly. "I have used the exact same local union crew for 20 years. I do not know any Summit Apex." I pulled up the state business registry on my secondary browser tab. I typed in the limited liability company name. The registered agent was listed as a generic corporate privacy service, which was standard practice for shell companies actively trying to hide their true owners. But they had made a sloppy, arrogant mistake. People who think they are smarter than everyone else, they always make sloppy mistakes. The billing address for the LLC matched a post office box located in downtown Seattle. I dug further, pulling the tax routing numbers attached to the vendor payments and cross-referencing them with a public property records database. It took me another 30 minutes of relentless clicking, my right hand flying across the trackpad as fast as I could manage, but I eventually found the hidden thread. The registered manager for the corporate privacy service was another shell company, and that shell company was registered directly under Bradley's name. The money from my father's hard-working commercial tenants was not going toward roof repairs or new air conditioning units. It was being systematically routed through a fake contracting business directly into a private bank account controlled entirely by my sister and her husband. I felt a profound freezing chill run straight down my spine, replacing the lingering medical numbness of the stroke with a completely different kind of paralysis. I opened up the historical data, filtering the records all the way back to the exact month my father had proudly handed them the keys to his accounts. I started pulling every single invoice submitted by Summit Apex Contracting alongside two other highly suspicious vendors I quickly identified in the general ledger. I created a fresh spreadsheet. With every fraudulent number, I inputted the total climbed higher and higher. $50,000, $120,000, $200,000. I pulled out my cell phone with trembling fingers and opened my sister's social media pages. I began comparing the dates of the largest, most fraudulent corporate withdrawals against the dates of her most boastful, extravagant posts. The correlation was undeniable and absolutely sickening. In March of last year, they had billed my father's estate $25,000 for a completely fabricated foundation repair on a warehouse. 3 days later, Stephanie posted a glossy photograph of her brand new custom-ordered Porsche SUV, complete with a long caption about being so incredibly blessed and married to such a hard worker. In November, a fake invoice for $40,000 in commercial landscaping matched perfectly with their 2-week luxury vacation to the Amalfi Coast. They had used my father's retirement funds to clear massive personal credit card debts, pay for exclusive country club memberships, and fund a lifestyle they could never actually afford. I sat in that sterile hospital bed staring at the glowing spreadsheet, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me that had absolutely nothing to do with my cardiovascular system. The contrast between her life and mine hit me with the force of a physical blow. I thought about the last 4 years of my life. I thought about the countless nights I sat alone at my tiny kitchen table, crying silently over a towering stack of medical bills, trying desperately to figure out how I was going to afford Leo's specialized speech and occupational therapy. I thought about how I lived on buttered noodles and skipped my own meals just so I could buy the expensive sensory-friendly clothing that did not make my autistic son scream in physical pain. I thought about how I had taken on extra weekend accounting clients, ruining my own health, pushing my blood pressure so dangerously high that my brain had literally short-circuited on my kitchen floor. While I was begging the universe for just a little bit of breathing room, while I was literally working myself into a devastating stroke just to keep my disabled child safe, and provided for my sister was orchestrating a massive financial crime against our own father. She was robbing the man who had swung a hammer his entire life to build something secure for our family, and she was doing it with a perfectly practiced smile on her face. The betrayal went far deeper than a refused phone call. She was stealing the resources that could have secured her nephew's future just so she could impress strangers at a wine tasting. I hid the sum function on the master spreadsheet. The final undeniable number flashed on the screen in stark black and white. $356,420. I slowly rotated the laptop on the tray table so the screen directly faced my father. He did not say a single word. He just sat there, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy increments, staring at the final figure. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched as the horrific reality of the betrayal sank deep into his bones. This was not just a simple case of poor business management or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, predatory, systemic theft. His own daughter, the golden child he had trusted above all others, had been treating his legacy like her personal automated teller machine, all while treating her own sister like disposable garbage. My father's breathing grew ragged. His large hands resting heavily on his denim-clad knees balled into fists so tight his knuckles turned completely white. I looked at the man who had just saved my life, the man whose life savings were being siphoned away to pay for imported wine and luxury car payments, and I felt my own heart break for him. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "We have all the proof we need. It is all right here on this screen. The routing numbers, the fake corporations, the forged invoices. It constitutes federal wire fraud and grand theft. Do you want me to call the police right now? I can have a financial detective look at this tomorrow morning. They will both be arrested and charged before the week is over." My father slowly turned his head to look at me. The expression in his eyes sent a shiver straight through my soul. There was no sadness left in him. The grieving father was gone, replaced entirely by a man composed of devastating, calculated resolve. He reached out with one steady hand and gently closed the laptop screen, ending the blue glow in the room. "No," he said, his voice dead cold. "Do not call the police. Prison is too easy. They would just hire fancy lawyers and play the victim. I have a much more painful punishment in mind." 4 days after my father drove me home from the law office, I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to regain the fine motor skills in my left hand. I was gripping a rubber therapy ball, squeezing it over and over until my muscles ached. Leo was in his bedroom, happily sorting his colored blocks into perfect, uninterrupted geometric patterns. The house was quiet. It was the kind of fragile quiet that always precedes a major storm. Then the doorbell rang. I pushed myself up from the table, favoring my right leg, and walked slowly toward the front door. When I opened it, I found my sister standing on my front porch. Stephanie was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and carrying her oversized designer handbag. In her other hand, she held a single generic brand can of chicken noodle soup. It was the kind of cheap high-sodium soup you buy for 99 cents at a discount grocery store. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I needed help. She just pushed past me, walked right into my modest living room, and placed that single insulting can of soup onto my coffee table. "I brought you lunch," she announced, looking around my small house with an expression of profound pity. "You look terrible, Clara. You really should put on some makeup." I closed the front door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I knew exactly what she was doing. Stephanie never did anything without an agenda. I slowly walked over to the armchair and sat down, keeping my right hand resting casually over my phone, which was sitting on the end table. I swiped the screen awake using my thumb and silently tapped the voice memo app, hitting the red record button. I let the phone sit there, capturing every single word. Stephanie sat gracefully on the edge of my sofa, crossing her legs and smoothing out her perfectly pressed slacks. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, placing a hand over her heart, as if she were the one carrying the weight of the world. "We need to have a serious talk about your future, Clara." She began using that condescending, sugary tone she usually reserved for salespeople she deemed beneath her. "Bradley and I have been discussing your situation extensively. You just had a stroke at 31. You are practically disabled. And let us be completely honest, your little bookkeeping job is not going to cover the massive mountain of medical debt you are about to inherit." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch out. I knew my medical bills were completely irrelevant now, safely hidden behind the ironclad protection of my father's living trust. But Stephanie did not know that. She thought I was drowning. She thought she had me cornered. "I am listening," I said quietly, making sure my voice sounded appropriately weak and defeated. Stephanie leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with toxic ambition. "You clearly lack the physical and financial capacity to be a proper mother right now," she said, lowering her voice into a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "Leo requires constant, exhausting attention. He is a financial drain, Clara. All those specialized therapists, the sensory diets, the constant monitoring. You cannot afford it. You cannot even afford to feed yourself properly." She gestured vaguely toward the cheap can of soup she had brought me. I tightened my grip on the armrest. "What are you suggesting, Stephanie?" I asked, forcing my words through a tight jaw. "I am suggesting you do the responsible thing for once in your life," she replied without a single ounce of hesitation. "There are state-run residential facilities equipped to handle children with his condition. State-funded wards, Clara. They take the financial burden completely off your shoulders. You sign over custody to the state, let them deal with his daily meltdowns, and you focus on paying off your medical debt. It is the only logical solution. He is too much for you. He is a burden to this family. My blood ran entirely cold. She was sitting in my living room, casually suggesting I abandon my beautiful, innocent 6-year-old boy to an underfunded government ward simply because she viewed him as a drain on our family's resources. She wanted me to throw my child away so she would not have to look at our struggles. I felt a surge of pure, violent rage burning in the back of my throat. I wanted to stand up, grab her by her designer cashmere collar, and throw her right out of my house. But my father had taught me better. He had taught me how to lay a trap. I took a slow, deep breath, bearing my anger beneath a mask of absolute submission. I looked down at my lap, making myself appear small, broken, and completely devoid of hope. "I do not know, Stephanie," I whispered, letting my voice waver just enough to sell the performance. "State facilities are so bleak. I love him. Love does not pay the bills, Clara," she snapped, rolling her eyes as if I were a foolish child refusing to eat my vegetables. "You have to face reality. Bradley and I are moving into a very critical phase of wealth management with Dad's portfolio. We cannot have the family name associated with financial ruin or have you begging us for handouts every month to pay for his autism therapies. We have an image to maintain. Do the right thing. Make the call to social services." She stood up, smoothing her hair, fully satisfied that she had delivered her brilliant advice. She walked to the front door, pausing only to look back at me one last time. "Think about it," she said. "I will check on you next week. Try to pull yourself together before then." The door clicked shut behind her. The second she was gone, I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. I had 22 minutes of crisp, high-definition audio. I had her explicitly admitting that she viewed my son as a burden to their social image. I had her urging me to abandon him. I saved the audio file to 3 separate secure locations and sent a direct copy to my father. My father did not text back. He did not need to. 3 hours later, a professional courier arrived at Stephanie's luxury condo delivering a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. Similar envelopes were delivered to Bradley's parents, William and Cynthia, at their sprawling estate across town. William and Cynthia were the absolute epitome of corporate snobbery. They measured human value entirely by bank account balances and country club memberships. They had always treated me like an embarrassing distant relative, politely ignoring my existence while loudly praising Stephanie for being such a wonderful match for their son. They believed Bradley was destined to inherit my father's entire real estate empire, effectively merging 2 massive pools of wealth into one unstoppable corporate dynasty. The invitation my father sent was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. It was formal, elegant, and entirely cryptic. It read, "Thomas requests the honor of your presence for a formal Sunday dinner at his estate to discuss the final transition of the family assets and the future of the commercial portfolio." When I read my copy of the invitation, I had to sit down at my kitchen table to catch my breath. My father was a master chess player. By using the phrase "final transition of the family assets," he knew exactly how Stephanie and Bradley would interpret it. They would read those words and immediately conclude that my father was formally retiring and handing the keys to the kingdom directly to Bradley. By inviting William and Cynthia, my father was deliberately setting the stage for maximum exposure. He wanted the people they cared about most, the people whose approval they desperately craved, to have front row seats to their absolute destruction. The trap was set. All we had to do was wait for them to walk right into it. The days leading up to that Sunday felt like waiting for a bomb to detonate. I spent my time working from home organizing the massive stack of forensic accounting documents I had pulled from the cloud drive. I printed out every single forged invoice from Summit Apex Contracting. I printed the bank routing numbers that traced the stolen $350,000 directly into Bradley's private accounts. I placed every single document into a thick black binder, indexing them with colored tabs so I could pull up the exact proof within a fraction of a second. On Saturday night, exactly 24 hours before the dinner, my phone rang. I was sitting on the floor of Leo's bedroom, helping him build a massive tower out of his wooden blocks. He was smiling, making soft, happy sounds as he perfectly aligned the edges. I looked at the caller identification. It was Stephanie. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said quietly. "Clara, Are you ready for tomorrow? Stephanie asked. Her voice was absolutely buzzing with euphoric energy. She sounded like someone who had just won the lottery and wanted to make sure everyone else knew about it. Ready for what I asked. Playing dumb. Oh, do not act like you do not know. She laughed a bright, condescending sound. Dad is finally handing the real estate portfolio over to Bradley. He is officially making Bradley the managing director of the entire estate. William and Cynthia are flying in from their vacation home just for the announcement. It is going to be a huge night for our family. I kept my eyes on Leo, watching him carefully place a red block on top of a blue one. That sounds very important, I said mildly. It is important, Clara. She stressed, her tone suddenly shifting into a harsh reprimand. Which is exactly why I am calling you. You need to look presentable tomorrow. Do not show up looking like a tired, depressed single mother. Wear a nice dress. Do your hair. William and Cynthia are going to be there, and they do not need to be reminded of how much you are struggling right now. We need to project success. I swallowed the bitter taste of anger in my mouth. I will wear something appropriate, I promised her. Good, Stephanie replied, sounding slightly mollified. And listen, Clara, I know you are drowning in those medical bills from your little hospital stay. I talked to Bradley about it. If everything goes smoothly tomorrow, if Dad signs the operating agreements over to us without any hassle, I will have Bradley set up a small monthly allowance for you. Nothing major, just a few $100s to keep the debt collectors off your back. A small monthly allowance. She was offering me a tiny, pathetic fraction of the very money she had been stealing from our father for 4 years. She thought she was being generous. She thought she was playing the benevolent, wealthy sister, tossing pennies to the poor. You just need to sit there, smile and be grateful, Stephanie commanded, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute authority. Do not bring up your medical debt. Do not bring up Leo. Do not do anything to ruin the mood. Let Dad have his moment of handing the legacy over to us. Just be grateful for whatever allowance Dad allows us to give you. Do you understand, Mami? I looked around Leo's quiet, safe bedroom. I thought about the $3.2 million living trust sitting in a locked safe at Robert Davis's law office, a trust that currently had my name written across every single page. I thought about the forensic accounting binder sitting on my kitchen counter, filled with enough evidence to send her husband to federal prison and leave her completely destitute. I understand perfectly, Stephanie, I said. My voice was incredibly soft, but it carried a lethal, unbending promise that she was completely incapable of hearing. I will be exactly what I need to be tomorrow. I will sit at the table, I will smile, and I will make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve. That is all I ask, she said, entirely missing the gravity of my words. See you tomorrow at 6. Do not be late. She hung up the phone. I lowered the device to my lap and looked at my son. Leo turned his head, making brief, beautiful eye contact with me, and offered me a small, pure smile. I reached out and gently stroked his soft hair. The fear that had paralyzed me on the kitchen floor a week ago was completely gone. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a failing body. I was a certified public accountant, armed with irrefutable proof, backed by a father whose wrath was about to level a city block. Stephanie thought tomorrow was her coronation. She thought she was walking into a dining room to be handed a crown. She had absolutely no idea she was walking straight into an execution, and I was going to be the one to pull the lever. Sunday evening arrived with a crisp chill that settled over the neighborhood. My father lived in a beautiful historic colonial home that sat at the end of a sweeping oak-lined driveway. It was a massive and imposing property, but it was not bought with inherited money or handed down through privileged connections. My father had built his entire life with calloused hands, aching muscles, and unrelenting grit. He had poured concrete framed walls and managed difficult construction crews for 40 years to afford this estate. Tonight, as I drove my modest sedan up that long driveway, the house looked like an impenetrable fortress. I parked near the back entrance, taking a long moment to breathe the cool evening air before unbuckling Leo from his car seat. I carried his special noise-canceling headphones and his blue divided dinner plate in my tote bag. Walking up the brick steps, I felt a strange sense of absolute unwavering calm. The helpless terror that had gripped me a week ago on my kitchen floor was completely gone. I was walking into a war zone, but I was the only one who knew the bombs were already planted beneath the floorboards. I walked through the heavy front doors and stepped directly into the grand dining room. The space was pristine and immaculate. The long mahogany table was set with my father's best crystal glasses, fine china, and heavy silver cutlery that gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier. The rich, savory smell of roasted lamb and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen, where a private catering staff was quietly and efficiently working. Stephanie was already there, effortlessly playing the role of the perfect hostess. She wore a stunning emerald green silk dress that likely cost more than my entire monthly rent. She was directing the caterers with sharp, arrogant flicks of her wrist, acting as if she already owned the house and everything inside it. When she finally noticed me walking in, she offered a tight, patronizing smile. She looked at my simple black dress and sensible flat shoes with a look of poorly concealed pity. I did not react. I simply nodded to her, kept my face perfectly neutral, and guided my son to his designated seat at the very far end of the long table. Bradley was standing by the stone fireplace, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with expensive amber bourbon. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit him with razor-sharp precision. He was loudly holding court with his parents William and Cynthia, who had flown in from their vacation home specifically for what they believed was going to be a grand coronation. William and Cynthia were the exact kind of people who measured human worth entirely by zip codes, country club memberships, and designer labels. Cynthia wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light every time she turned her head, and she surveyed the room with a look of smug satisfaction. William stood with his chest puffed out, swirling his drink, and nodding approvingly at his son. Bradley was bragging at the top of his lungs. He wanted to make sure his voice carried across the entire room. He talked endlessly about his grand vision for expanding the portfolio. He used ridiculous, empty corporate buzzwords, boasting about how he was going to leverage the commercial assets, synergize the new tenant agreements, and bring my father's old-fashioned real estate empire into the modern era of wealth management. He spoke about my father's life work as if it were simply a starter kit for his own massive ambition. Stephanie drifted over to stand beside him, wrapping her arm through his, painting the perfect picture of a successful, wealthy young couple ready to inherit the world. I sat quietly at my corner of the mahogany table, gently feeding Leo. I had brought his specific dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets and carefully arranged them so they did not touch his steamed carrots. I kept my attention focused entirely on my son, offering him soft words of encouragement when the noise in the room grew a little too loud, but my ears caught every single arrogant word echoing through the dining room. William leaned over and loudly congratulated my father on having the wisdom to step aside and let fresh blood handle the complicated money matters. Cynthia chimed in with a high-pitched laugh, saying how incredibly blessed my father was to have a son-in-law with such a brilliant, sophisticated financial mind to secure the family legacy. Through it all, my father sat silently at the head of the table. He did not agree with them, and he did not argue. He just watched them. He watched Bradley sip his premium bourbon. He watched Stephanie parade around the room giving orders to the staff. He watched William and Cynthia act like they had just conquered a new territory. My father sat there with the still, terrifying patience of a seasoned predator, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. His eyes were dark, cold, and completely unreadable. The caterers brought out the main courses, serving the roasted lamb, the potatoes, and the seasonal vegetables with quiet efficiency. The clinking of silver forks against fine china filled the room. Bradley continued to dominate the conversation, offering his unsolicited opinions on the current state of the commercial real estate market, and heavily implying that my father had left a lot of money on the table by being too conservative in his old age. Stephanie occasionally glanced down the table at me, offering me that same sickeningly sweet, condescending smile she had worn in my living room when she told me to surrender my child to a state facility. She thought I was broken. She thought I was sitting there silently out of sheer defeat and desperate gratitude for the small monthly allowance she had promised to throw my way. As the dinner plates were finally cleared away and the caterers poured the last rounds of red wine, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A palpable sense of anticipation settled over William, Cynthia, Bradley, and Stephanie. This was the moment. They all leaned forward slightly in their heavy wooden chairs, waiting for my father to officially announce his retirement and formally hand the control of his massive estate over to Bradley. Stephanie practically vibrated with excitement, her eyes fixed on my father. My father slowly reached out and picked up his heavy crystal wine glass. He picked up his silver knife. He tapped the side of the glass 3 times. The clear, sharp ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the dining room. Total silence fell over the table instantly. Bradley sat up perfectly straight, pulling on the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket. Cynthia clasped her hands together under her chin. Stephanie smiled so widely it looked like her face might break. They were completely ready for their triumph. But my father did not raise his glass for a toast. He set the crystal back down on the table. He did not smile. The heavy, dark look in his eyes seemed to physically lower the temperature in the room. He reached down to the floor beside his chair and lifted a massive, heavy black binder. He dropped the binder directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. It landed with a loud, violent thud that made the crystal glasses rattle and caused Cynthia to jump in her seat. "I invited you all here tonight to discuss the final transition of my assets," my father began. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, booming resonance that commanded absolute authority. For 40 years, I worked until my hands bled to build a foundation of security for this family. I believed that wealth was supposed to be a tool to protect your blood, to care for the vulnerable among you, and to ensure that the people you love never have to face the world alone. I believed in trust. I believed that when you hand the keys of your life over to your own family, they will honor that responsibility. He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out. Bradley swallowed hard, his confident smile faltering just a fraction. Stephanie looked confused, glancing at her husband with a slight furrow in her brow. This was not the glowing speech of praise and succession they had expected, but I have learned a very harsh lesson recently. My father continued, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. I have learned that sharing DNA does not guarantee loyalty. I have learned that some people will look at a vulnerable, disabled child and call him a burden. I have learned that some people will leave their own sister paralyzed on a floor so they can go to a party. And I have learned that a fancy suit and a business degree are often just a convenient disguise for a common thief. William bristled, sitting back in his chair with a look of deep offense. "Thomas, I do not know what kind of metaphor you are trying to make here, but this is highly inappropriate for a family dinner. We came here to celebrate Bradley taking over the portfolio." My father slowly turned his head and locked his cold eyes directly onto William. Then he looked at Cynthia. Finally, his gaze settled on Bradley and Stephanie. "There is no metaphor, William," my father said, his voice hard as steel, "and Bradley will not be taking over anything. Bradley is a criminal. Over the past 4 years, your brilliant son and my eldest daughter have systematically robbed me. They have embezzled exactly $356,420 from my commercial property accounts." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Cynthia gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. William stared at my father, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. Stephanie froze completely, all the blood rushing out of her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified ghost. Bradley panicked. Sweat instantly broke out across his forehead. His confident corporate posture collapsed. He stammered, pulling at the collar of his expensive shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. "Thomas, wait. You are completely misunderstanding the numbers," he said, his voice pitching high and breathless. "That was not theft. That was simply aggressive market reallocation. We were shifting capital to cover preventative maintenance and optimize tax liabilities. It is standard corporate practice. The ledgers might look confusing to someone without a modern financial background, but I can assure you every penny is accounted for." I did not say a word. I simply reached into my tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen, entering my passcode, and swiped down to the control center. I pressed the screen mirroring button and connected my device directly to the large flat-screen television mounted on the dining room wall behind my father. The television blinked to life, filling the dim dining room with a bright, glaring light. "I have a modern financial background, Bradley," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, "and there is absolutely nothing confusing about these ledgers." Every single eye in the room turned toward the television screen. I opened the first document in my digital file. It was a high-resolution scan of an invoice from Summit Apex Contracting. I used my finger to zoom in on the $12,000 charge for commercial roof repair. "You billed my father for a roof repair on a building that has not had a new roof in 15 years, I explained, swiping to the next slide. Then I pulled up the state business registry documents I had pulled during my audit in the hospital room. I magnified the screen until Bradley's own name and private post office box filled the television. You created a shell company. You routed the money from my father's commercial tenants directly into this fake business, and from there, you funneled it straight into your personal accounts. I swiped again, bringing up a side-by-side comparison. On the left side of the screen was a forged invoice for $40,000 in landscaping services. On the right side of the screen was a photograph I had pulled directly from Stephanie's public social media profile. It was a picture of Stephanie and Bradley clinking champagne glasses on a private balcony in the Amalfi Coast, posted just 3 days after the fraudulent $40,000 check had cleared the bank. Aggressive market reallocation does not pay for luxury Italian vacations. Bradley, I stated softly. It does not pay for Porsche down payments. It does not pay for country club dues. You did not invest a single dime of this money. You stole it to fund a lifestyle you could not afford, and you did it while smiling in my father's face. William and Cynthia stared at the screen in absolute horrified silence. The evidence was irrefutable. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accounting error. It was documented, undeniable fraud, displayed in towering letters for everyone to see. Cynthia lowered her hand from her mouth and looked at her son with a mixture of profound disgust and deep embarrassment. They were people who cared entirely about social standing, and their son had just been exposed as a petty embezzler in front of them. Bradley opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate another excuse, but his voice failed him. He looked at the television, then at his parents, and finally down at his empty hands. The sweat was rolling down his face now, ruining the pristine image he had spent the entire evening trying to project. Stephanie sat completely paralyzed in her emerald green dress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. She stared at me from across the table, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in her before. She had spent her entire life underestimating me, dismissing me as a weak, exhausted burden. She had never considered for a single second that the quiet sister in the corner would be the one to orchestrate her absolute ruin. The dining room suffocated in a thick, unbearable silence. The clinking of glasses was gone. The arrogant bragging was dead. There was only the low hum of the television screen casting its harsh light over the ruins of their perfect life. The blinding light from the television screen washed over the dining room table, casting long, harsh shadows against the pristine walls of my father's colonial home. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. William and Cynthia Bradley's status-obsessed parents sat completely frozen in their high-backed wooden chairs. The smug, superior expressions they had worn all evening had melted away completely, replaced by a horrified, hollow realization. They were staring at the irrefutable proof of their son's grand theft, the forged landscaping invoices, the shell company routing numbers, the paper trail that directly linked my father's stolen commercial real estate funds to their son's private bank accounts and Stephanie's luxury European vacations. Bradley looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His expensive, custom-tailored charcoal suit suddenly looked entirely too big for him. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he frantically searched his parents' faces for any sign of support, any lifeline he could grab onto. But there was nothing. William slowly lowered his gaze to the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching. Cynthia pressed her hand against her chest, looking at her son with absolute unfiltered disgust. They worshipped wealth, but they worshipped reputation even more. And Bradley had just destroyed their family name in front of the man he had robbed. But my father was not finished. He had not gathered this audience simply to expose a financial crime. He was a man who built his life on loyalty, hard work, and protecting his blood. He had watched his eldest daughter systematically drain his life savings, but far worse than the stolen money, he had listened to her abandon me when I was lying paralyzed on my kitchen floor. He had listened to her dismiss my beautiful autistic son as garbage. My father stood up slowly from the head of the mahogany table. He placed his calloused hands flat on the polished wood and leaned forward. The sheer physical presence of him seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the room. He did not look at Bradley. He turned his cold, unrelenting gaze entirely onto Stephanie. Stephanie shrank back into her chair. Her emerald green silk dress, which had looked so regal and commanding an hour ago now, just looked foolish, She opened her mouth, a desperate, trembling smile forming on her lips. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense pressure of his stare. "Dad, please, you have to know we were going to pay it back. It was just a temporary loan. We were going to fix it." "You do not get to speak," my father said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, devastating rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the voice of a man who had spent his entire life building a legacy, only to discover the rot hiding inside his own foundation. "You do not get to offer me excuses, Stephanie. You do not get to sit at my table, drink my wine, and smile in my face after what you did." He reached down and picked up the heavy black binder sitting in front of him. He opened it, not to the financial documents, but to the legal section in the back. "Do you remember what you told your sister last week?" My father asked, a deadly calm in his voice, making the hair on my arm stand up. "Do you remember when Clara called you begging for her life, terrified that she was having a stroke, terrified that her little boy was going to be left alone in the house? Do you remember the words you used?" Stephanie squeezed her eyes shut. A single pathetic tear rolled down her cheek, ruining her perfect makeup. I was scared, she choked out, playing the victim exactly as she always did. I did not know what was happening. I was overwhelmed. "Stop lying," my father commanded. "I was standing right there in the kitchen, Stephanie. I heard every single word through the speakerphone. I heard you tell your own flesh and blood to stop being dramatic. And I heard you call my grandson a burden." Cynthia let out a sharp, audible gasp. She turned to look at Stephanie, her eyes wide with fresh shock. Even a woman as shallow as Cynthia drew a hard line at abandoning a sick family member. The room grew so quiet, I could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Because you look at my grandson as a burden," my father continued, his voice booming across the dining room, "I am going to show you the absolute weight of real consequences. You thought you were going to walk in here tonight and take over my portfolio. You thought you were going to inherit my life's work. You thought you had fooled me completely." My father pulled a thick-bound stack of legal documents from the binder. It was not a simple last will and testament. It was the ironclad, revocable, living trust he and Attorney Davis had drafted the day I was discharged from the hospital. "I have spent the last week restructuring my entire estate," my father announced, dropping the heavy document onto the table. "Every single property I own, every strip mall, every warehouse, every stock portfolio, and every liquid asset has been permanently transferred into a private living trust. The total value of this estate is exactly $3.2 million. And as of this morning, Clara is legally named as the sole beneficiary and the sole successor trustee of every single penny." The words hit the room with the force of a physical blow. Bradley slumped back in his chair, running a trembling hand over his sweating face. His golden ticket, the massive real estate empire he had been counting on to fund his country club lifestyle and cover up his massive debts, was completely gone. It had vanished into thin air. Stephanie lost whatever fragile grip on reality she had left. She burst into hysterical, hyperventilating tears. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, the sound echoing sharply across the room. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "I am your daughter. You cannot just cut me off. You cannot give everything to her. She is just a bookkeeper. She does not know how to manage real estate. I am your blood. You cannot leave me with nothing." My father did not flinch. He did not yell back. He just watched her completely unravel, with a terrifyingly calm, completely detached smile on his face. It was the smile of a man who had already planned 5 moves ahead in a chess match his opponent did not even know she was playing. "I did not leave you with nothing, Stephanie," my father said softly. Stephanie stopped screaming. She froze, her chest heaving as she desperately grabbed onto that tiny sliver of hope. She wiped her eyes, smearing dark mascara across her cheeks. "You did not," she whispered, her voice trembling with cautious relief. "No," my father replied, flipping to the very last page of the trust document. "I instructed my attorney to leave you exactly 5% of the total estate. When I pass away, the trust allocates roughly $160,000 to you." Stephanie let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at Bradley, a triumphant spark returning to her eyes. $160,000 was not the millions she had planned on stealing, but it was still a massive sum of money. It was enough to pay off their immediate credit card debts. It was enough to keep the Porsche. She actually started to compose herself, reaching for her linen napkin to dab at her ruined makeup. She thought she had survived the storm. She thought my father was ultimately too weak to completely destroy her. But my father tapped his finger against a specific highlighted paragraph at the bottom of the page. However, my father said, his voice dropping into a dark, unforgiving tone that made the air in the dining room feel instantly freezing. There is a very specific, legally binding condition attached to your inheritance. It is written right here under Clause 7. Stephanie paused the napkin hovering near her face. What condition, she asked cautiously. To receive a single penny of that money, my father explained, enunciating every single syllable. With brutal clarity, you must secure a full-time minimum wage. Support staff position at a certified, state-run autism care facility. You must work on the floor directly supporting the children you are so quick to call a burden. You will change sheets. You will clean up messes. You will assist the exhausted nurses and therapists who dedicate their lives to helping vulnerable kids. Stephanie stared at him, her mouth hanging open in absolute horror. You cannot be serious, she breathed. I am not a janitor. I have a degree. I do not do that kind of work. You will do exactly that kind of work, my father fired back, his voice rising in volume. And you will maintain that full-time position for 5 consecutive years. Not 4 years. Not 4.5 years. 5 full continuous years. And every single Friday, you will submit a formal signed performance review from your facility manager directly to Clara. Clara will have total unquestioned authority to verify your employment. If Clara decides your performance is lacking, you get nothing. Stephanie started shaking. Her hands trembled so violently that her crystal wine glass rattled against the table. Bradley looked like he was going to be physically sick. The trap was closing around them, snapping shut with ruthless mechanical precision. And if I refuse, Stephanie cried out, fresh tears pouring down her face. If I say no to this insane demand, you cannot force me to scrub floors. You cannot control my life from the grave. What if I just walk away from the money? My father smiled again, but this time the smile was absolutely devoid of any warmth. It was a cold, calculated promise of total destruction. If you refuse, my father said, leaning closer to her, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. If you quit after 4 years, if you get fired for a bad attitude, if you complain to a judge or try to contest this trust or send your sleazy lawyers to harass your sister. If you step 1 single inch out of line, Clara has very specific instructions. I pulled the black binder closer to me on the table. I rested my right hand on the heavy cover, feeling the absolute power of the evidence inside. I looked at Stephanie, letting her see the cold, unyielding reality in my eyes. I was no longer the exhausted, terrified sister she could walk all over. I was the gatekeeper to her survival. If you fail to meet the conditions of Clause 7, my father continued, locking eyes with Bradley. Clara will take this binder containing every forged invoice, every fake shell company registration, and every routed bank transfer, and she will hand-deliver it directly to the district attorney. We have $356,000 worth of documented wire fraud and felony embezzlement sitting right here on this table. William Bradley's father let out a low groan and buried his face in his hands. He knew exactly how the corporate world worked. He knew exactly what was coming next. If that binder goes to the district attorney, my father said, his voice ringing with absolute finality, Bradley will be immediately fired from his firm. He will be stripped of his corporate licenses. He will be permanently disbarred from ever working in finance again. The state will seize your luxury condo. They will repossess your vehicles, and they will freeze your bank accounts. Bradley will go to a federal penitentiary for grand theft. And you, Stephanie, as the co-signer on those fraudulent LLCs, will go to prison right alongside him as an accessory to the crime. The dining room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The reality of the ultimatum crashed over Stephanie and Bradley like a tidal wave. They had no leverage. They had no way out. My father had not just cut them out of his will. He had cornered them completely. He was holding the very keys to their freedom, and he was handing those keys directly to me. Stephanie's hands shook violently. She looked at Bradley, begging him silently to fix it, to find a legal loophole, to use his fancy corporate negotiating skills to save them. But Bradley was completely broken. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, completely defeated, realizing that his greed had just cost him his entire future. Stephanie let out a loud, agonizing sob. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed back into her heavy wooden chair. She covered her face with her trembling hands, crying hysterically as the absolute magnitude of her new reality finally sank in. She had called my beautiful son a burden. She had told me to throw him into a state facility so I could focus on paying off the medical debt she thought I was drowning in. And now, to avoid spending the next decade in a federal prison cell, she was going to spend the next 5 years of her life working minimum wage in an autism care facility, scrubbing floors and answering directly to the sister she had left for dead. My father sat back in his chair, took a slow, deliberate sip from his crystal water glass, and looked across the table at me. We did not need to say a single word. Justice had finally been served, and it was absolutely beautiful. The silence in the dining room was so absolute that the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the central heating pushing warm air through the vents. William and Cynthia sat completely frozen in their high-backed mahogany chairs. They were staring at the television screen that still displayed the undeniable hard evidence of their son stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The smug, superior expressions they had worn all evening had melted away, replaced by a horrified, hollow realization. These were people who worshipped their social standing above all else. They measured human worth by country club memberships and clean reputations. And now they were forced to look at the irrefutable proof that their son was nothing more than a common thief. William was the first to move. He slowly placed his linen napkin on the table. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered repulsion. He stood up from his chair, buttoning his custom-tailored suit jacket with trembling fingers. Bradley scrambled to his feet, his face covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. He reached out toward his father, frantically stammering out half-formed excuses about temporary loans and aggressive financial strategies. William did not even raise his voice. He simply looked at Bradley with cold, dead eyes and told him he had disgraced the family name. He told Bradley that he was disgusted to share the same bloodline. Cynthia did not even look at her son. She did not look at Stephanie. She grabbed her expensive silk wrap from the back of her chair and walked straight toward the front door without a single backward glance. Bradley chased after them down the hallway, begging for just 5 minutes to explain himself, but it was entirely useless. The heavy oak front door slammed shut right in his face. The loud sound echoed through the quiet house like the final strike of a judge's gavel. Stephanie remained collapsed in her dining chair. She was weeping loudly, her chest heaving with heavy, panicked sobs. Her perfect hair was a mess, and dark mascara streaked down her cheeks, completely destroying the flawless image she had spent hours cultivating. She looked down the table at our father, pleading with her eyes for some kind of mercy, hoping that the man who had loved her for 33 years would suddenly soften and take it all back. But my father just sat there, with a spine made of absolute steel. He looked at the daughter who had called his autistic grandson a burden, the daughter who had left me to die on a kitchen floor, and he felt absolutely no pity. He calmly took a sip of his water, set the crystal glass down, and told Stephanie and Bradley to get out of his house. He told them never to return unless Stephanie was coming to hand me her signed performance reviews from the autism care facility. Bradley walked back into the dining room, looking completely defeated. He grabbed his sobbing wife by the arm and pulled her out the door. I sat quietly at the end of the table and began packing Leo's special divided plate and his noise-canceling headphones into my tote bag. My father walked over, gently placed his large calloused hand on my shoulder, and kissed the top of my head. We did not need to speak. The air in the house felt incredibly light, as if a toxic, suffocating fog had finally been blown out the windows. I drove Leo home that night feeling a profound sense of peace. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. I should have known that a woman like Stephanie would not simply surrender her ego without a desperate, ugly fight. She had spent her entire adult life getting exactly what she wanted by manipulating everyone around her. She was living in a state of deep, frantic delusion. She simply refused to believe that she was actually trapped. Over the next 5 days, my phone constantly vibrated with unhinged text messages and furious voicemails from my sister. She called me a witch. She accused me of brainwashing our father while I was in the hospital. She swore she was going to destroy me and rip the trust apart piece by piece. I did not respond to a single message. I just deleted them and focused on my physical therapy, slowly regaining the strength in my left side and taking Leo to his speech classes. But behind the scenes, Stephanie was scrambling. Cut off from my father's stolen real estate funds, the reality of their massive credit card debt was crashing down on them. Bradley had been placed on immediate administrative leave at his corporate firm while they investigated his personal accounts. Desperate for a way out, Stephanie hired a highly aggressive, morally bankrupt attorney located in downtown Seattle. He was a shark known for taking on messy probate fights, a man who specialized in tying up family estates in court for years until the opposing side simply ran out of money and surrendered. Exactly 1 week after the dining room confrontation, I received a thick, certified legal envelope in my mailbox. I opened it at my kitchen table, my heart beating a little faster as I read the aggressive legal jargon. Stephanie's lawyer had drafted a vicious civil suit against me and my father. The document officially claimed that Thomas was mentally unfit to manage his own estate. It alleged that he was suffering from severe undocumented cognitive decline. Worse, it accused me of elder abuse. The suit claimed that I had used undue influence to manipulate a sick, confused old man into signing away his entire $3.2 million fortune while I was recovering in the hospital. The lawyer threatened to file an immediate injunction to freeze the entire trust, demanding that the court appoint a neutral third party to manage the money until a judge could determine my father's mental competency. For a brief, terrifying second, a wave of panic washed over me. I remembered the crushing anxiety of my hospital bills. I worried that if a judge actually froze the trust, Stephanie could drag this out for a decade, draining the estate with endless legal fees just out of pure spite. I immediately picked up my phone and called my father, reading the lawsuit to him with a shaking voice. My father did not sound worried at all. In fact, he actually laughed. It was a deep, hearty chuckle that instantly calmed my racing heart. He told me to put Leo in his car seat and drive straight to attorney Robert Davis's office. He said he had been waiting for Stephanie to try a foolish stunt exactly like this. When my father and I walked into Robert Davis's sprawling corner office overlooking the Puget Sound, the attorney was already holding a copy of the lawsuit. Stephanie's lawyer had faxed it over that morning as an intimidation tactic. Robert was not intimidated. He was smiling. He took the aggressive, threatening legal letter and casually tossed it into his wastebasket. Robert told us that Stephanie's lawyer was relying on the standard playbook for greedy, disinherited children. The lawyer was betting that we would be too terrified of a long, expensive court battle and would simply offer a massive cash settlement to make the lawsuit go away. They thought they could bully us into submission, but they had absolutely no idea how thoroughly my father had prepared for this exact moment. Robert opened a locked drawer in his heavy mahogany desk and pulled out a thick, sealed medical file. He placed it on the desk and folded his hands over it. He explained to me that my father was a man who understood the importance of a solid foundation. Before my father had even asked Robert to draft the revocable living trust, he had taken a crucial, devastatingly smart preemptive step. He knew Stephanie would eventually try to claim he was losing his mind. So exactly 48 hours before he signed the legal documents transferring his $3.2 million estate to me, my father voluntarily subjected himself to a rigorous battery of psychological and neurological evaluations. He did not just see one doctor, he went to 3 separate highly respected board-certified psychiatrists in the state of Washington. He underwent hours of intensive cognitive testing, memory assessments, and psychiatric profiling. I looked at my father in absolute awe. He had sat through grueling medical exams just to completely bulletproof my future. Robert opened the medical file and showed me the results. Every single doctor had signed sworn, notarized affidavits confirming that Thomas was in perfect mental health. He had passed every cognitive test with absolute flying colors. The psychiatrists had explicitly noted on his official medical record that his mind was sharper and more resilient than most men half his age. He was completely, undeniably competent to make his own financial decisions. The claim of mental unfitness and undue influence was entirely dead on arrival. If Stephanie's lawyer tried to present that argument to a judge, he would be laughed right out of the courtroom. But my father and Robert Davis were not just going to defend themselves against the lawsuit. They were going to completely obliterate it. Robert reached into his desk drawer one more time and pulled out a large manila envelope. He opened it and pulled out a pristine, legally formatted document that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a fully drafted criminal complaint. Robert had taken the massive black binder of forensic accounting evidence I had gathered. He took the forged landscaping invoices, The fake commercial roof repair bills, the hidden shell company registrations, and the bank routing numbers that traced the stolen $350,000 directly to Bradley and Stephanie. He had compiled every single piece of undeniable proof into a comprehensive legal filing for felony wire fraud and grand embezzlement. The document was completely finished. It was fully signed, dated, and legally certified. It was sitting right there on the mahogany desk, absolutely ready to go. Robert looked at me with a sharp professional intensity. He explained that this criminal complaint required exactly one single postage stamp to be sent directly to the local district attorney's office. The moment that document left his office, Bradley and Stephanie would be facing federal indictments, massive financial restitution, and years in a prison cell. Robert Davis did not call Stephanie's lawyer to negotiate. He did not ask for a meeting. He simply called a private legal courier. That very afternoon, Robert sent a response packet directly to the aggressive downtown lawyer who had threatened us. The packet contained a very brief, incredibly cold legal letter stating that the claims of undue influence were baseless. Attached to the letter were the 3 sworn psychiatric evaluations proving my father was perfectly sane. And right behind those medical records was a full unredacted copy of the criminal complaint for felony embezzlement, complete with every single forged invoice and stolen bank transfer. Robert included a single final sentence at the bottom of his cover letter. He formally informed Stephanie's attorney that if the civil lawsuit was not officially withdrawn by 5 o'clock that evening, the criminal complaint would be filed with the district attorney the very next morning. The legal blockade was absolute suffocating and entirely inescapable. When Stephanie's aggressive ambulance-chasing lawyer received that packet, he opened it expecting a desperate plea for a settlement. Instead, he found himself staring at documented, undeniable proof of a federal crime. Lawyers might be willing to file nasty civil suits for a quick payday, but no competent attorney will ever risk their own legal license to protect a client who is actively engaged in documented felony fraud. The lawyer realized instantly that his client was not a poor victimized daughter trying to save her father from a manipulative sister. His client was a criminal who was trying to extort money to cover up her own massive theft. He knew that if he pushed this case into a courtroom, he would look like an absolute fool and his clients would go straight to jail. At 4:30 that afternoon, exactly 30 minutes before the deadline, Robert had said my phone rang. It was a voicemail from Stephanie. I sat at my kitchen table, looking out the window as the sun began to set, and pressed play. There was no furious screaming this time. There were no toxic threats. There was only the sound of a woman who had finally run into a wall she could not charm, manipulate, or buy her way over. Her aggressive lawyer had called her just moments before. He had officially dropped her as a client, effectively firing her over the phone. He had warned her in the strongest possible terms to drop the civil suit immediately, to return the stolen funds if she could, and to do absolutely everything her father demanded if she wanted to avoid spending the next decade in federal prison. Clara Stephanie's voice trembled through the speaker, small, broken, and completely defeated. My lawyer just called me. He dropped my case. He told me about the criminal complaint. She let out a long, ragged sob. The sound of her despair did not move me. I felt no pity for the woman who had happily suggested I throw my child into a state institution so she could keep her country club membership. "Please do not send that file to the police," she cried, her voice entirely stripped of its usual arrogance. Bradley just got officially fired from his firm. They found irregularities in his expense reports. We have nothing left. We are putting the Porsche up for sale tomorrow morning. We are going to have to break the lease on the condo. I will do whatever Dad wants. I promise. Just please, Clara, do not ruin my life. She hung up the phone. I erased the voicemail, set my phone down on the table, and went into the living room to hold my son. The battle was over. The counterstrike had been perfectly executed. Stephanie was completely blocked from the family wealth, completely isolated from any legal help, and staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. The trap had snapped entirely shut. She had absolutely no way out, nowhere to run, and no one to manipulate. Her only option left in the entire world was to put on a pair of medical scrubs and start scrubbing floors. The speed at which karma arrives is truly a remarkable thing to witness in real time. For my entire life, I had watched my sister and her husband glide through the world on a cloud of unearned privilege, stepping on anyone who inconvenienced them, completely convinced that their wealth made them untouchable. But once the foundation of their lies cracked open, their entire kingdom came crashing down with a spectacular, terrifying velocity. The fallout from my father's formal dining room announcement did not take months or even weeks to materialize. The destruction of their perfect life began the very next morning. Bradley had built his entire corporate identity on a carefully crafted illusion of undeniable success. He paraded around his downtown Seattle wealth management firm in custom-tailored suits, projecting the image of a financial genius destined for the partner track. But the corporate finance world is an incredibly small, tightly knit community that thrives on reputation and completely despises scandal. Word of our dining room confrontation leaked out almost immediately. Perhaps my father made a quiet, strategic phone call to a few industry connections. Perhaps attorney Robert Davis casually mentioned the severe legal situation to a colleague over a private lunch. Regardless of exactly how the information traveled, Bradley arrived at his glass-walled corporate office that Monday morning to find his security access badge completely deactivated. The firm had caught wind of his profound personal financial irregularities and the looming threat of a massive federal embezzlement investigation. When corporate auditors start aggressively looking for discrepancies, they always find them. By Wednesday afternoon, Bradley was formally and publicly escorted out of the towering office building by a pair of massive security guards. He was forced to carry his personal belongings in a cheap cardboard box, walking right past the very senior partners he had been so desperate to impress at the country club wine gala just a week prior. He was officially stripped of his prestigious title, his six-figure salary, and his entire corporate reputation in a matter of hours. The firm immediately revoked his generous severance package, pending the ongoing criminal fraud investigation. The golden boy of high finance was suddenly unemployable, permanently blacklisted from the industry, and absolutely terrified of his future. This immediate financial severing acted like a violent domino effect on Stephanie's perfectly curated, incredibly expensive life. Stephanie had spent the last 4 years using my father's stolen commercial real estate money as a bottomless well to fund her intense delusions of grandeur. Without those fraudulent wire transfers quietly masking their massive personal credit card debts, the harsh financial reality hit them like a runaway freight train. By the end of the second week, Stephanie received a highly embarrassing publicly delivered notice right in the middle of the country club dining room. Her exorbitant monthly membership dues had bounced. The club manager, a man she used to treat like a personal servant, quietly but firmly asked her to leave the premises and not return until her account was fully settled. The sheer humiliation of being escorted out of her sacred social circle in front of her wealthy friends was just the beginning of her nightmare. The luxury Porsche SUV, the pristine custom-ordered vehicle she had paraded all over her social media accounts to prove her undeniable superiority, quickly became a massive financial liability. They could no longer afford the astronomical monthly lease payments. I heard from our aunt that Stephanie and Bradley were forced to drive the pristine car down to a discount auto lot on a rainy Tuesday morning. They practically begged the dealership manager to take it off their hands. They sold it at a catastrophic, gut-wrenching financial loss just to keep the bank from officially repossessing it and completely ruining their credit scores. But selling the luxury car was not nearly enough to stop the heavy financial bleeding. The monthly rent on their downtown luxury condo was staggering. With no corporate income, no stolen real estate funds, and no wealthy parents willing to bail them out, they were completely trapped. Bradley's parents, William and Cynthia, had completely cut all ties to avoid the public scandal, treating their own son like a contagious disease. With absolutely zero options left, my sister and her husband were forced to break their residential lease. They had to abandon their beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows, their imported marble countertops, and their panoramic views of the city skyline. They hastily packed their designer clothes into heavy black garbage bags and moved into a tiny, outdated, cramped apartment on the far outskirts of the city limits. The irony of the situation was incredibly poetic and deeply satisfying. Stephanie was now living exactly the kind of modest paycheck-to-paycheck life she had spent years mocking me for enduring. Every single piece of her fake, arrogant identity had been systematically dismantled and stripped away, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of her own terrible choices. The terrifying reality of absolute bankruptcy was rapidly closing in on them, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the overwhelming, suffocating terror of a federal prison sentence. The fully drafted criminal complaint for felony wire fraud and grand embezzlement sat patiently on attorney Robert Davis's mahogany desk, fully certified and ready to be filed the exact second Stephanie tried to deviate from my father's strict instructions. She had absolutely no leverage, no legal loopholes, and no escape route whatsoever. The only thing standing between her and a 10-year federal prison sentence was Clause 7 of my father's ironclad living trust. She had to secure a full-time minimum wage position as support staff at a certified state-run autism care facility. She had to clean up physical messes. She had to humbly serve the very children she had so callously and cruelly dismissed as a burden. The absolute horror of this new reality completely paralyzed my sister, but she had absolutely no choice. She had to swallow every single ounce of her massive inflated ego just to survive. The wealthy woman who had once flatly refused to leave a high-end hair salon to save my life was now forced to drive her cheap, newly purchased used car to a discount medical supply store. She had to buy a set of cheap, scratchy, generic uniform scrubs. I can only imagine the bitter, defeated tears she shed as she stood in front of her new cramped bathroom mirror, trading her imported silk blouses and heavy pearl necklaces for an ill-fitting, stiff polyester uniform. The local autism center she applied to was a highly respected but severely understaffed facility that desperately needed dedicated, hardworking support workers. They hired her on the absolute spot, thrilled to have someone willing to do the heavy lifting, the deep cleaning, and the intense physical organizing required to keep the large center running safely and efficiently. Stephanie was immediately assigned to the sanitation and sensory room maintenance crew. Her daily job description was brutally clear and incredibly demanding. She was required to meticulously sanitize the active play areas, deep clean the heavy therapy equipment, assist the exhausted nurses with difficult physical patient transitions, and ensure the environment was perfectly maintained for the children at all times. She was no longer a wealthy, untouchable socialite giving arrogant orders to private caterers. She was a minimum wage, entry-level employee taking strict orders from floor managers who were half her age. Her very first day on the job was a quiet, rainy Tuesday. I spent that exact same afternoon sitting in my own warm, peaceful living room, helping Leo trace his alphabet letters in his colorful workbook. He was laughing softly, completely safe, entirely comfortable, and beautifully oblivious to the incredible justice unfolding across town. I knew exactly what Stephanie was going through in that facility. I knew the intense physical exhaustion of being on your feet for 8 hours straight while carrying heavy cleaning supplies. I knew the profound emotional toll of working in a high-stress, sensory-heavy environment filled with unpredictable challenges. But unlike the deeply dedicated, loving professionals who consciously choose that noble career path to help others, Stephanie was doing it out of pure, desperate, miserable survival. At 5:30 in the evening, exactly 30 minutes after her first grueling shift finally ended, my cell phone rang. I looked down at the caller identification on the bright screen. It was Stephanie. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, steady breath to center my emotions before finally picking it up. I did not say hello. I did not offer any greeting. I just held the phone to my ear and waited in absolute silence. The sound that came through the speaker was a wet, ragged, miserable sob that seemed to tear straight from the bottom of her lungs. Clara. Stephanie wept, her voice completely broken, trembling, and entirely stripped of all its former arrogant polish. Clara, please, you have to talk to Dad. You have to tell him to stop this immediately. I cannot do this. I absolutely cannot do this anymore. I am so tired. My back is killing me. I spent the entire afternoon scrubbing finger paint off the walls and cleaning up the cafeteria after children who cannot even speak to me. One of them threw a massive screaming tantrum and knocked over an entire heavy tray of sanitizing supplies. It took me 2 hours to mop it all up on my hands and knees. The floor manager actually yelled at me in front of everyone for being too slow. Clara, please, I am begging you. I am your sister. We share the same blood. You cannot make me do this for 5 entire years. I will go completely crazy. Please just tell Dad to give us the money and let us move on with our lives. I will never bother you again. I promise you will never have to see me. I will completely disappear. Just please, I am begging you, lift this condition." I sat there in my quiet living room and simply listened to her completely fall apart. I listened to the woman who had mocked my struggles beg for mercy she did not deserve. And as I held the phone to my ear, my mind immediately transported me back to that terrifying Friday evening. I vividly pictured myself lying completely helpless on my cold kitchen floor, my left side entirely paralyzed, unable to breathe properly, desperately fighting to stay conscious. I pictured my beautiful Leo hiding in the far corner of the kitchen, pressing his small hands tightly over his ears, screaming in pure, unadulterated terror because his world was collapsing. I remembered the exact venomous, disgusted tone my sister had used when she told me to just put my child in front of a television so she could go drink expensive wine at a country club gala. Listening to her pathetic sobs, I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no guilt, no remorse, and no sisterly obligation. I only felt the solid, undeniable, unbreakable weight of a mother's fierce protection and the deep satisfaction of perfect justice. I waited patiently for her loud, dramatic sobs to quiet down to a pathetic, breathless whimper. I kept my voice perfectly calm, entirely level, and completely devoid of any sympathetic emotion. "You looked at my beautiful, innocent little boy," I said softly, making sure every single word landed with absolute precision. "You looked at a child who needed love, patience, and understanding, and you told me he was a burden. You explicitly told me to surrender my own son to the state so you would not have to look at our struggles. You happily threw my life away for a country club party, Stephanie." Stephanie let out another loud, desperate cry, trying to stammer out an apology, but I did not let her interrupt me. "My father gave you exactly what you earned." I continued, my voice steady and completely unmoved by her tears. "You built this cage entirely by yourself with your own greed. Now I highly suggest you go, get some rest, wash your polyester uniform, and set your alarm clock, because you have 4 years, 11 months, and 29 days left on your sentence." I took a deep, calming breath, looking over at my wonderful son, who was smiling brightly at me from the living room floor, perfectly safe and perfectly loved. "You said Leo was a burden," I told her, my voice turning to absolute unforgiving ice. "Now learn how to carry it." I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the red button, cutting off her sobs instantly. The line went completely dead. I did not block her phone number because I needed her to be able to send me those strict weekly performance reviews to ensure she remained compliant. But as I set the phone down on the table and walked over to hug my son, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never answer another phone call from her again. 6 months have passed since that terrifying night on the kitchen floor. 6 months since the heavy wooden door of my father's dining room clicked shut, sealing my sister out of our lives and securing my son's future. It is strange how the human mind measures the passage of time. When you are trapped in a state of constant survival, grinding away at a corporate job for 10 hours a day while drowning in overwhelming medical debt, every single hour feels like a physical weight pressing heavily down on your chest. You count the agonizing minutes until you can finally collapse into bed, only to wake up completely exhausted and do it all over again. But when you are finally free, when the heavy, suffocating chain of financial terror and toxic family manipulation is completely severed, time begins to flow entirely differently. It heals. It breathes. I woke up this morning to the soft golden light filtering through the large windows of my spacious new bedroom. I stretched my left arm, feeling the steady, reliable strength of the muscles that had once been entirely dead and paralyzed. The physical therapy was incredibly grueling. There were many long days when I wanted to give up, days when my muscles ached with a dull burning fire. But I pushed through every single rigorous exercise, driven by the absolute certainty that I was fighting for my son's right to have a healthy mother. Today, my grip is strong. My physical balance is totally restored. The lingering shadow of that transient ischemic attack is nothing more than a quiet reminder of exactly what I survived and exactly what I fought so hard to protect. I am completely free from the crushing anxiety of medical debt. My father's ironclad trust wiped the slate entirely clean, paying off the hospital bills, the ambulance ride, and the extensive neurological scans with a single effortless wire transfer. I no longer lie awake at 2 in the morning, staring blindly at the ceiling, doing frantic mental math to figure out how I am going to keep the lights on and pay for Leo's vital care. That quiet, suffocating dread has been completely banished from my life forever. We did not just move into my father's massive colonial estate. My father completely transformed a sprawling private wing of the historic house entirely for Leo and me. He hired specialized contractors, men he trusted implicitly from his decades in the commercial construction business, to build a safe, sensory-friendly environment where my son could absolutely thrive. The walls are painted in soft, calming shades of blue and slate gray. The lighting is fully adjustable, completely free of any harsh, buzzing fluorescent bulbs that used to severely overwhelm Leo's delicate nervous system. My father even had heavy soundproofing insulation installed in the walls and thick plush carpeting laid across the hardwood floors to absorb sudden noises and create a beautiful cocoon of absolute tranquility. Every single morning, I watch my father, a man with calloused hands who spent 40 years building towering commercial structures, sit cross-legged on the soft carpet to play vintage wooden trains with his grandson. He does not see Leo as an inconvenience. He never asks him to be quiet or tells him to stop flapping his hands. He completely enters Leo's world with infinite patience and deep abiding love. Watching the two of them together, I realize with profound clarity that this is what a real family looks like. It is not about country club memberships, perfectly tailored corporate suits, or parading around charity galas to impress shallow strangers. True family is the quiet, unglamorous dedication of simply showing up for the people who need you the most. My father built a fortress for us, a sanctuary, where the toxic greed of the outside world simply cannot reach us. With the immediate threat of bankruptcy completely erased, I was finally able to step off the exhausting corporate treadmill. I marched into the logistics firm, where I had sacrificed my physical and mental health for years, handed in my formal resignation letter, and walked out the heavy glass doors feeling lighter than air. I used my extensive background as a certified public accountant to launch my own remote consulting firm. I now manage complex financial portfolios and tax strategies for a select group of private clients, and I do it entirely from a beautiful sunlit office right down the hall from Leo's playroom. I set my own hours. I dictate my own professional schedule. If Leo needs me in the middle of the afternoon, I simply close my laptop and walk down the hall. I no longer have to beg an unsympathetic boss for time off, and I certainly no longer have to endure the profound humiliation of begging a selfish, arrogant sister for a moment of basic human decency. My financial independence is absolute. The deep, agonizing fear of not being able to provide for my disabled child has been entirely replaced by a solid, unshakable confidence in my own professional abilities. I built this new life on a foundation of truth, hard work, and the absolute refusal to ever be treated like a disposable burden again. But the most beautiful, miraculous change has not been in my physical recovery or my financial stability. The most breathtaking transformation has been in my sweet, wonderful boy. With the incredible resources of my father's living trust, we were finally able to hire the absolute top-tier, highly specialized therapists in the entire state. Leo now receives intensive daily occupational therapy, speech therapy, and sensory integration therapy from professionals who treat him with profound respect and genuine affection. He is no longer simply surviving in a loud, chaotic world. He is absolutely blossoming. The severe, terrifying meltdowns that used to overtake his little body have drastically reduced. The rigid, anxious routines have slowly softened into a beautiful, curious exploration of the environment around him. Yesterday afternoon, I was sitting on the floor of his sensory room, quietly watching him line up his wooden train cars. For years, Leo would never look directly at me. The emotional intensity of eye contact was simply too overwhelming for his specific neurological wiring to process. But yesterday, something incredibly magical happened. He stopped moving his trains. He turned his small body toward me. He lifted his head, looked directly into my eyes, and held my gaze for 5 long, beautiful seconds. His eyes were so bright, so full of pure, unfiltered trust and deep connection. And then, without any prompting, without any heavy weighted blankets or verbal cues, he leaned forward and wrapped his small arms tightly around my neck. He rested his cheek against my shoulder and squeezed me. It was the very first genuine, unprompted hug I had ever received from my son. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his soft hair, and I wept silently. I cried tears of such profound, overwhelming joy that my chest physically ached with the weight of it. My sister had looked at this beautiful, magical, incredibly loving child and called him a burden. She had viewed his neurological differences as a massive inconvenience to her perfect, shallow social image. She wanted me to throw him away into a sterile state-run facility just so she would not have to look at our daily struggles. She missed out on the absolute greatest joy of knowing a heart as pure as Leo's, because she was entirely blinded by her own toxic greed and intense selfishness. She traded the unconditional love of an innocent child for fraudulent bank transfers and luxury cars that she no longer even owns. I am sharing this deeply personal story with you today because I know there is someone out there right now listening to my voice who feels exactly like I did on that cold kitchen floor. I know there is someone who feels completely paralyzed by the toxic behavior of their own family. Someone who is constantly making themselves smaller, swallowing their rightful anger, and accepting severe emotional abuse just to keep the peace with people who do not truly value them at all. For 31 years of my life, I firmly believed that sharing DNA meant you owed someone your absolute unconditional loyalty. I believed that family was supposed to be a sacred bond, and that if my sister was cruel to me, it was somehow my fundamental job to endure it, to turn the other cheek, and to suffer in absolute silence. I thought setting boundaries made me the villain of the story. I was completely and utterly wrong. The blood flowing in your veins does not grant anyone a free license to exploit disrespect or abandon you in your darkest hour. Love is not a financial transaction. It is not an obligation you blindly fulfill just because you grew up inside the exact same house. Real love is measured by who stands faithfully beside you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them. Setting firm, unyielding boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of vicious revenge. It is an act of basic fundamental survival. You cannot properly protect the people you love if you allow yourself to be constantly drained and manipulated by the people who do not care about you at all. My sister and her husband fully believed they could step on anyone to build their fragile empire of lies. They thought their expensive tailored suits, their luxury imported cars, and their exclusive country club memberships made them completely untouchable. But greed is a very patient and persistent debt collector. It always eventually comes to collect exactly what is owed. They traded their family, their personal integrity, and their entire future for a pile of stolen money. And in the bitter end, they lost absolutely everything. Stephanie is currently living the exact miserable, desperate reality she spent years laughing at, putting on medical scrubs every morning to work for minimum wage just to avoid a federal prison sentence. Meanwhile, I am living a life of absolute undeniable peace, surrounded by the two people who love me most in this world. You do not owe your precious peace to anyone who consistently brings dark chaos into your life. You do not owe your silence to people who refuse to hear your truth. You have every single right to walk away, to lock the door behind you, and to build a beautiful, secure fortress for yourself and the people who actually matter. If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with a toxic family member, type the word boundary in the comments. Let me know where you are watching from today. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next story on the screen right now. You deserve peace. Until next time.